Well, as you can tell, it's a really formal setting, and so, you know, we don't encourage any, you know, chatting or anything, so.
Cell phones off.
Yeah, so everything's off, cell phones off, you know, or at least put it on a really nice tone. I'm Melissa Hart. I go by Hey You, I go by whatever the hell my, you know, people need me to do if they need my help. Lauren Kovash, we're out of the St. Louis office, and we essentially do most of the TRI work for Sage. Basically, our backgrounds have been from prior lives in a lot of industry. I came from industry. I have 15 years with the automotive and the aircraft manufacturing, and then I've been in consulting. I'm actually at that magic mark. I've been 15 years in private industry, and now I'm 15 years in consulting. So we hit a major milestone. I'm kind of like, good, hurry up and get that loaded to her, and I can retire soon. So Lauren's project manager in our office in St. Louis, and we have project technical Alex Carlson in our office as well. And interesting, Sage obviously has a lot of the petrochemical and the refinery background on the air side. We are every other industry known to mankind, and we do everything from Tier 2 TRI reporting to stormwater pollution prevention plans, SPCC plans. I do Homeland Security, CFATS compliance work for anybody in Sage. There's not much we don't do. We also do a little process safety work with our safety guys. We're more the multimedia and the auditing compliance arm, so that type work, if you need it, we could, you know, run down to the plant and go say, oh, well, what did we end up buying here? So that's part of what we do over in the St. Louis office. Want to welcome you. Thanks for coming. It's probably this is the 5th or 6th set of courses that we have taught. We did have one in St. Louis that Tricia was signed up for, but nobody else signed up, and we figured it was probably a little too close to holidays and all that stuff, so you graciously came down here for it, so thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, I'm down in Corpus Christi, so it was all
yeah, so it's easier, not as traveling, and it's darn cold, you know, so at least you stayed in a little bit warmer weather. All of these courses are the HSE University Illuminate Your Brain series. We offer these all year round. The EPCRA classes are just getting kicked off. We just started those last year. Obviously we have a lot of the courses offered this week here at Sage, being like, you know, B1, LDAR, air permitting essentials. We're adding more and more. Lauren and I actually are going to be talking to our Vice President of Training about maybe even putting on some auditing, you know, environmental auditing classes too. And I have a very good friend, lawyer, who is actually really cool, and he has done a lot of work. I've worked with him a lot. I've actually recommended him to quite a few of my clients, and we've done lots of voluntary disclosures for things that we have fun finding when we do our audits. So Lauren's part of our auditing group as well, so it works out really nicely. We are going to have on Thursday the EPCRA for experts. What this is, you know, you never can get enough of TRI, so we decided to have a full day class on TRI. That's one of my passionate things. Lauren's, you know, coming of it as well, that we actually like to work on this stuff, which probably makes us really sick individuals, but we do like it. And we have a couple more people in our firm that we do pretty constant TRI. We answer questions year round for anybody. We answer lots of questions to a lot of our into our offices when we come up, and then, you know, we try to stump each other, find out. We try to establish consistency amongst our reporting to make sure that when we're training our new associates in TRI, that they understand the pitfalls and look at the lessons, and even when we're helping out our clients, that even if we're just doing data input, which you do a lot of that they know how to look for things, look for little potential arrows, emissions, you know, issues that we have seen. Obviously, we're here at 4C. We are offering these classes again in New Orleans next month. We did some classes in January in Baton Rouge and probably had about 6 or 8 people. So again, it never hurts because it becomes much like a refresher, but then there's always constant things that we try to update and bring to the table. Safety moment. always we start out here as just, you've already been here at 4C, so we know where bathrooms are, exits, and getting out of the hotel. So that's, nothing too big. I'm starting to moderately learn where I'm going here, but I've messed up, I still think, every day on having to find out where the rooms are. And the elevators. And Lauren was helpful. She goes, just listen for the ping, so we're all good. Just listen for the ping. And I thought, that's really a good idea. I'm a chemical engineer. I've been, I guess it's 28 plus, that's how you get to 30. Isn't it? But I have done EPCRA for a good 25 years. I don't know how I just fell into it, but I started McDonnell Douglas Aircraft in St. Louis like a good engineer. All good engineers, or not good engineers, but just engineers start at McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, and you have to do your stint there no matter how long. So I did my stint there, and I started in plant engineering. And then they needed somebody to do underground storage tanks, so somehow that fell into my realm. I did process piping work, so I started doing TRI and just love it. More because it's all encompassing and it wasn't just air and it wasn't just waste and it wasn't just water. You really get into that process work of really having to know your processes and how it evolves. So we've been having a lot of fun with it. Lauren's been with me ever since she's been out of school. So she's a graduate from Vanderbilt and civil engineer, super sharp, makes my life easy. I drug her on her first EPCRA audit with me, and just it's easier to train. So we did an air and EPCRA assessment at a pump and compressor manufacturing facility in Oklahoma, and it was a lot of fun. Just it's fun to teach. So she kind of cut her teeth pretty early on it, learned fast, and now I'd say she has more experience than a lot of people who've been out for 15, 20 years. So it's we have another manager in Chicago, Kari Keegan, and we're kind of we're the team here to hit on the TRI stuff. So we QA/QC each other's work, and we'll send out secret emails and say, hey, I got asked this over here from somebody in Austin. Here's my answer. What do you think? And then we'll send that out so that we establish some consistency in the office. But introductions, I know we've got a gigantic group here, so introduce yourself and tell us about you.
Adam Lefevre. I'm a software engineer for Environmental Systems Corporation. We're a DAS vendor here in Austin.
Got it, great.
Trisha James. I'm the chemical management owner at Corpus Christi Flint Hills Refinery.
Great. Good.
A lot of Flint Hills people here. There
Yeah.
are 2 or 3.
There's a lot of us.
There is a lot. They're everywhere.
I feel like Flint Hills we just have huge environmental departments at all of our facilities.
That's
compared
awesome.
to other places that worked.
I'm Ronald Keckline. I work for Huntsman Chemical up in the Woodlands in the corporate EH&S group. I'm in the environmental team for that.
Good.
My background is I came from consulting to Huntsman about 8 years ago. Did a lot of corporate audits and a lot of the
Good.
internal support for our plants.
Wonderful.
So we sold a bunch of plants to Flint Hills just
Yeah.
4 or 5 years ago, I think. All my base chemicals, Port Arthur, Odessa, and a few others.
Did you guys sell stuff to Ashland as well? No, I used to work for Ashland. So it sounded familiar.
Yeah, I did some work thousands of years ago. It was Ashland and Huntsman. It was right, but so that's. I'm not surprised. We'd heard some. I'd done some work in Missouri that we had some stuff. There was an old facility.
Yeah.
Huh. Good. What we're going to cover on EPCRA is we will cover some TRI, obviously, because that is a section of EPCRA, but we're also going to take a look at all the different intermix of the regulations, because EPCRA does comprise quite a few reporting requirements as well as notifications, and so we wanted to make sure that we cover all of those. Both the basic requirements, also getting a look at here's what the instructions are. There's a lot of Q&A. EPA loves to have their policy, become regulation, even though that's not legitimately done. But they do defer a lot to their policy and their guidance documents, especially in the chemical reporting sector, especially for EPCRA, mostly for TRI. But we will take a look at that. We want to take a look at some of the policy and especially some of the enforcement. There's been a whole lot more going on. I know in Region 7, which comprises Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska, There's been a lot. They are on a roll with EPCRA and RMP audits. And what Lauren and I found out is that, at least in Region 7, the guys who do RMP also do the EPCRA, the TRI auditing, and they cross-mix them. So when they go there and they see that something's messed up, they can nail you for both, which is not very fun. They won't nail you for multimedia unless they send a team out there, but they will hit you on RMP as well as EPCRA. And I'm sure that you're probably, if you have done enough of this, you're used to EPA websites, but there's getting more and more. The data's coming in and much more available. There's a lot more work that's out there you can take a look at. And then we will do a basic TRI overview. If it isn't something that you're as familiar with, it never hurts to have a refresher. We do refreshers every year for our people, and it's amazing what they think that they know about the rule and what they have forgotten. Just the interplay of manufacturer, process, or otherwise used. We still have discussions about it. We're still finding out that they're misusing it. Or we get a new client and you're like, oh my, can we just start from scratch? That'd be easier. The detailed TRI reporting, as I said, when we get to the advanced TRI, we really get deep into a lot more, fun questions and go into the Q&A. But we will go take a look at the corrections, any modifications. There's always plenty of the holy whatever moments that you have. I mean, if you've done TRI for any number of years, you have them almost all the time. Common errors, misconceptions, and again, we'll also even look at auditing and record keeping. We do cover how the environmental groups and the public use this data, and it's really fascinating what they've done, and they're getting really savvy about it as well. So again, that's how a lot of the enforcement actions, it also leads to how they use it. I mean, they use it for environmental justice all the time. I did update our enforcement slides just because there's more stuff coming out, and they're getting, it's not cheap. So we will cover. For EPCRA and SARA, please, and seriously, having the smaller groups, I like, just because ask questions, just, throw it out there. If you have a question, you don't understand something, or you want to just ask a question, then this is one of those that we can just, it's a good play. We can find out what, help each other out and have some good discussion. Basically for EPCRA and SARA, I mean, you have the emergency planning section, which is your section 302. You have then the right to know reporting. So there's your MSDS, it's your tier 2 that's due, of course, at the end of the week, and then your TRI reports due in July. We also will talk about some of the CERCLA EPCRA release reporting that occurs under section 304, like your continuous release reporting requirements and emergency releases. Again, a lot of the things that center there where the enforcement comes about is how soon do you make that phone call? And it gets pretty tedious, but they're starting to nail you if it's over, if you call after a 2-hour period. So again, we will cover some of that work. Sometimes that applies, sometimes it doesn't. Glossing over EPCRA Emergency Planning Community Right to Know, that is a statute that came out of the SARA Superfund Amendments Reauthorization Act. So they're both statutes. Implementing regulations are what we have to deal with for Tier 2 TRI. CERCLA obviously is your Superfund, and again, they all kind of pull together because it is what are you dealing with when you have a chemical release, chemical response, utilizing the chemicals and making sure that the public knows about them. Key definitions, just want to cover the SERC. This is your State Emergency Response Commission. This is basically the implementing agency that EPA is delegated to keep an eye on emergency response actions when you have chemical releases. EPCRA is a federal program. It is not a state program. However, the states implement, they're supposed to oversee, they can charge you fees, but if you're going to be audited, it will be done by EPA and EPA only, not the state level. States can take a look at it, but if there is going to be enforcement, it will come from the feds. extremely hazardous substances. This will be your chlorine, your ammonia, and of course sulfuric acid contained in lead acid batteries running around in your forklifts and parts washers and scissor lifts, and the one that's missed almost constantly on tier 2 evaluations. Threshold planning quantity, that's your threshold. It's either going to be 10,000 pounds, or it's going to be 500, or it's going to be something different than that, just depending on the list and what state you're located in. Of course, they can't be consistent. If you're in Louisiana, you have it at 500 pounds for every hazardous substance. The background on EPCRA all centers to Union Carbide and Bhopal. The 15,000 people, approximately 15,000 people were killed when they had the methyl isocyanate leak. And because of that, Congress decided we have got to pass something so that something like this does not happen in the United States. So it was focused on the fact that you have storage and handling of toxic substances, hazardous substances as defined by OSHA. And then in 1990, when Congress passed the Pollution Prevention Act, you started getting into more of the heavy-duty TRI reporting, where they wanted a lot more knowledge on the waste management data and your release data, source reduction, pollution prevention activities. Under Section 302, what this basically covers is that if you have an extremely hazardous substance on site, you have to do a one-time notification to the SCRC, the LEPC, which is the local emergency planning committee. EPA has lists for every state. You can go on their website and they will have a listing, and it also includes your local fire department. You may have multiple fire departments who have jurisdiction over your plant, especially if it's sprawling. They are all part of this. And you need to notify them that once you've hit a threshold planning quantity, let's look at your sulfuric acid is 1,000 pounds. And a lot of people get that mixed up. 1,000 pounds is the TPQ. 500 pounds, though, is what triggers you having to send in an MSDS or sign in for a tier 2. So if once you hit that at any one time, and this means you could literally have a tanker truck of ammonium hydroxide on site, you've disconnected the motive power, and it's going to stay there for a week. Let's say you got some special job, you're going to be cleaning out a whole bunch of tanks and drums, and you've just got some work where you're going to need that. If it is there for a week, for calendar year 2014, obviously if you have a tanker load of that stuff, it's exceeding 10,000 pounds, you're going to report it on your tier 2. Now, you're not going to report it the next year because maybe you don't even need it, but again, it is at any one time. If it's there for a day, you really are supposed to report it, okay? So if you have an EHS, and luckily with an EHS, I get a lot of people who ask, well, the list of lists, so that's all hazardous substances. I'm like, no, it is not. It is extremely hazardous substances. It's got the RMP list, the TRI list, CERCLA list. What else does it have on it? I think that's it. If you had all the hazardous substances, it would probably be full of this room. There's no way. I mean, water has an MSDS, so it's just a matter of making sure that if it's a hazardous substance, that's because it meets an OSHA standard, and it meets it for having some type of exposure issue or chemical reactivity or maybe an NFPA flammability. But if it's an extremely hazardous substances, you have a specific list. It is either an extremely hazardous substance or it's not. So that is where, again, we make that disparity.
For the sulfuric acid, I know that was one thing that came up in a recent audit. About how many batteries is the level that you're...
2 forklift batteries. If you have 2 forklifts, there's a darn good chance you're going to hit the 500-pound mark on sulfuric acid.
Electric forklifts.
Yeah.
Obviously, but
Right.
the big
Right.
batteries.
2 forklifts.
Right.
And a lot of people, what we've also found, good question, because every time we do an audit, there's always somebody who forgets about the forklifts. Forklifts, man lifts, scissor lifts, floor washers, all that gets included. Computer backup batteries, that gets forgotten a lot. All that should be pulled in. But typically about 2 forklift batteries, or 2 forklifts, because 2 forklifts have multiple batteries in there, and then if you have a charging station or anything like that, You got to have it. You know, other little things is, let's say that you have somebody take care, a contractor comes on site and they maintain new batteries. Well, if you still have a pallet of new batteries sitting on the floor, you know, that they just got dropped off and the guys haven't picked it up, you got to include that. Again, that's where you get into, you know, assessing what your typical and your maximum battery storage is on site. And you include the batteries in the forklifts that are running around all over your plant.
Right.
Okay?
And most people have spares. Right. They forget about
Yeah.
their spares.
Okay.
Right.
And an electric forklift, what, 6 batteries in the, so that's you talking about?
That sounds right.
About a dozen
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
batteries.
Right,
and
about a
you're
dozen
pretty close
batteries.
to the- Okay,
Right.
all right.
Right. Now, under emergency planning, you also, once you've identified the EHS, you send a letter to them. It's a one-page letter. It's really simple. In many cases, once you have that, you can also use the, you can use your Tier 2 submittal if this is the first time that you've done it, where a lot of times they now have checkoff boxes. This will also serve as our 302 notice, because you've got to let them know at that point in time. And again, keep in mind, when you have if you have a hazardous substance or extremely hazardous substance, a new one that comes on site, you're typically in that 60-day notice where you have to make it known to them that you have a new chemical on site. So you have to keep that track. And it's not a calendar year quarterly basis. It could be basically a rolling quarterly basis on when you get new chemicals. So when somebody orders for maintenance, that they order something in June and say, yeah, we got to have this, and we got a real good sale on it, so we got 4 pallets. Make sure that it has been evaluated so that you can get a note and put it in on your Tier 2. For Section 304 and Section 103 under CERCLA, once you have a release of an EHS or a hazardous substance that is produced, used, or stored at the facility under RECRA, we're also looking, this is where both of these kind of overlap some, because you do have chemicals that are on both lists. If you have a release, it requires immediate notification, okay? You have to call, it says typically within a 24-hour period. They will start doing enforcement even as within 2 hours. Okay, if you call within 2 hours of when you have a release, EPA won't say much. Depending on what it is, they can start looking at enforcement. There is a matrix, there is a policy guidance on enforcement of 311, 302, 304, and 312. 313 has its own enforcement policy guidance, and they actually measure it in increments of hours.
Is that a 24-hour rolling period or a block day?
24-hour ruling.
Okay.
Okay. If you do have to report a release, one of the things to really keep in mind, you may not know exactly how much has been released, but you'll have a general clue when you have it. Talk to whoever, the maintenance people, the process engineers, get an idea and make the phone call. There is no penalty to call back and reaffirm what the amount is, okay? And then if you find out that you're below the reportable quantity, then you send a letter and say, sorry, rescind, and let them know. It's okay. It's okay to do. When you have the release, you notify the state and local authorities that you've exceeded the reportable quantity for that particular chemical. You do want to contact the SERC. I mean, obviously you have it in probably in your corporate release notifications and standard operating procedures who you're supposed to call. But you want to make sure that you call the SERC, the LEPC, and I would also contact the local fire department, regardless whether there's an LEPC or not. When you have a CERCLA release, you contact the National Response Center, okay? And this is when we get into EPCRA can be within your facility boundaries, and then it could be migrating off. CERCLA releases are releases that occur outside of your facility boundary. EPCRA could be internal and it could be external, okay? The big piece about EPCRA is really the full protection of emergency response teams coming into your site to help contain a catastrophic release, or if you have a fire. That is really the whole purpose, and to notify the community that is outside of your facility in case something spreads and that they know what chemicals are there.
And I was gonna say, the biggest mistake I see on this during like compliance auditing would be having your reportable quantities wrong in your corporate handbook. So
Right.
they'd say like any release greater than 5 gallons. But you can have RQs as low as a couple grams, a
Right.
couple pounds, depending on the chemical. So it's really more about knowing what chemicals you have at your facility and knowing what their specific RQs are. It's not a set number.
And that's an excellent point, Lauren, because a lot of times, you have your corporate programs that we were just doing an audit. We were doing a full EPCRA assessment at a chemical plant, and the SOPs were really nice, but they were dated 2010. They need to be dated 2014 or 15. You need to update them because things change.
And you'll find your RQs in your list of lists.
Exactly.
What is the grace period, if you will, for contacting the authorities? Are you supposed to do it? I know it says immediately, but what are they?
Within 2 hours.
And some states will actually have it written up. Like I know, I guess I can't say which state exactly, but for some of them they'll say within 15 minutes.
That's
Right.
that's kind of what I
Right.
was getting at, because
It's,
I've heard 15 minutes and I've also heard 2 hours. So that's state specific.
So it can
Yeah.
be.
Okay.
State, yeah, and that's a problem. I mean, it's really a pain because you're just like, you want to have some consistency and you want to make sure, but
And
the
I was going to say, even your stormwater permit
Right.
can sometimes give you a different limit.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
But 15 minutes is, when I grew up at General Motors, they were the 15 minutes, and then you have this, long list of who you had to make the phone calls to, and of course you call corporate first, and then you
Oh,
call
yeah.
legal, and then, all the other stuff, it's a CYA, and then call the agency and let them know. I mean, that's
That
pretty
way we can
standard.
start working on
Exactly,
response.
exactly. So it's, the 15 minutes is one of those, this is like, my whole thing is, okay, 15 minutes, definitely way less than 2 hours. Okay, good. And when I finally realized that there was no, you're trying to give a best estimate, and then you do have to take your time to really kind of quantify what happened. I mean, you've got process, you've got all the manufacturing people. I mean, you're doing a whole lot. You have your hazmat team. I mean, depending on what it is,
Responding.
there's so many people responding. So it's just like, get as good of an idea as you can and make a phone call. You can always, again, there is no penalty for corrections or, we just, as we had done this one assessment, they had a lot of letters in there that says, upon, further discovery and investigation, we determined that the RQ was not exceeded, and thus we're rescinding this. And it was all good. You just keep notes of it and you're all good. But you don't want to get in trouble for failing to call. I had a client that they were a fun place. I mean, vegetable oil. It was really fun. You could ski across the floor. It was really fun when I went there. But they had an ammonia refrigeration system, and it was outside, and they got busted. What had happened is they only worked 5 days a week. Well, the valve broke. They think it was some little hooligans out running around, but it happened on a Saturday. Lost all their ammonia. Obviously, cloud, kind of going. People noticed it. They got called in and they got hit with fines. Why? Because nobody knew that it happened. Well, unfortunately, it's like that's really not good enough. They didn't make the phone call till Monday morning, so they got an $80,000 fine. They had to have an independent review. They had to have a redundant system put in place so that they had alarms and that it was tied to pagers or some type of notice to both contacts, the plant manager and the emergency response coordinator at the facility, because they're like, you need to be aware of what's going on at your facility even if you're not working. So again, they ended up spending a whole lot of extra money, but that was the whole purpose of it, because they had not made any notification. It happened on a weekend, and they had told them that for something like this with ammonia that they should have had the 15 minutes. But they started enforcement calculations after 2 hours.
We had a client who had inspectors come in from the state for a stormwater audit, and as they were walking the outfalls, saw a sheen at the outfalls, which would qualify as off-property boundaries NRC. 'C. call. So they got busted that way just during that stormwater.
Yeah.
But
once you have a release, once you make that phone call, the next part that happens is you have to follow up with a follow-up incident report. This is giving more detail as to what happened, how you corrected it, what steps you're taking, and this has all the details of basically the synopsis of what actually happened when you made that phone call. This is where, again, it allows you to give them more information on what happened, have a better idea of exactly how much the release amount was, and to include any other pertinent information. You want to put the chemical name. Do not just put, we had, IFC 2520. It's just like, no. Put what the what it contained. If you want to put the MSDS with it, that's fine. But give them an idea of what was the actual chemical, what the hazard characteristics were associated with it, how much was released, what is the duration? Was this a continuous release that occurred over hours? Was this a break in a valve and you lost X volume of product? Give them an idea of how long this occurred. Maybe just be a one-time thing. Could have been a rupture, but you want to make sure that they understand what's going on, okay?
And I was going to add, this list is from 40 CFR, so it's a regulatory requirement to include all of these items.
Right.
Not just like a BMP or a list that we put together.
Right.
So.
What is the nature of the release? Did it go to air? Did it go to water? Did it go to all? Did it end up getting, running down into a storm sewer? You need to be as specific and concise as possible. What were the steps that were taken to reduce the risk? And did you put, absorbent down? Did you make phone call? Did you flood it with foam? Again, how did you mitigate? And they do not specifically say, but if there's any other corrective actions that you put in place, we have had clients where they say that they now have put in a redundant valve, or they've added what corrective mitigation measures they've put in, so that something like that wouldn't happen again. That goes a long way, because that means that you're, taking control of what the problem is and making sure that there's not a problem. And then who the contact person is. Sometimes that could be corporate legal, that can be the plant manager, it could be the EHS director, not always the person who either made the phone call or it just depends on the company and who they designate to be the contact person. But make sure that that contact person knows that the report was filed and that they have a copy of it. Obviously, there's a lot of reportable releases, and what are the types here? You could have emissions to air, you have wastewater discharges, you could have a waste disposal, that you're sending off to landfill trucks, you could have forklifts, again, you could have forklifts running into things. That happens everywhere. Injection of liquid waste, transfers of waste and wastewater. All of these can occur. None of them can occur, one can occur, multiple can occur at your facility. So it's just making sure of what is deemed reportable and what you ought to be, and making sure that you have measures in place so that you can address them, because you want to be consistent. One of the things that we also see in standard operating procedures is assuring that as new personnel come on board who are going to be their EHS coordinator, that they understand how to handle reportable releases. When I started at General Motors, I'd been there a week, and I came from industry, so that helped. But I started there, and they had a contractor off-site who was actually high-pressure washing with water, what we call the trucks that carried a car through the assembly plant. And you get the baked-on paint from the paint booth, and you just use high-pressure water, and all the paint chips would come off. And then they'd sweep them up, gather them up. Well, they would do this in a parking lot. And then they would put boom and absorbent around a sewer, and then the water would go in there, no big deal. Well, the union was not, they wanted to do the work. They didn't like the fact that it was being outsourced. So here I am, I'm there for a week, maybe I was there for 2 weeks, and the only other guy who had handled some of the environmental work was on vacation. And the UAW was mad, so they called EPA and Missouri DNR and said they're flushing hazardous waste down the sewer. Mm-hmm. And it was all under the approval of General Motors, so yes. So of course I'm getting out there and I'm like, what the hell's going on? So my first thing was stop any of the operations that's out there. I had no idea what to do. So I was just like trying to be logical. Stop the operations, get a sample of the water wash that because they were collecting it before they dumped it down there. And of course I called up the UAW guy, and I was naive. I was like, what the hell are you doing?
Right.
And the union steward was, well, these guys are dumping this. I said, no, they're not. It's water. He goes, well, got the operation stopped, didn't it? And I thought, and of course, this is when I'm older. The filter wasn't as prevalent, back then. And I was like, we work for the same damn company. What the hell are you doing? And he's like, well, we didn't want it to be outsourced. Oh, okay. So you call the agencies to say that you're dumping hazardous waste down a sewer. I mean, it was just beyond my brain to comprehend. But again, make sure you have your ducks in a row. If I had known that, my thought is back then is it should have been that I should at least been able to give the operating procedure to at least read my first couple of days on there, especially when somebody else is going to be gone, to make sure who are the proper people to contact. I ended up getting it handled, and then I did contact somebody at corporate, but I didn't know anybody yet. So again, those are the things of being aware of when somebody new comes aboard or taking a position, to make sure they at least have the basic procedures down, such as what if we have a release or a spill.
Let your people take vacations.
Yeah.
That's your first problem.
Way back when. Well, that was way back when. That was years and years and years ago. Back in the early 90s, Federally permitted releases. I would assume that you may all be familiar. Are you familiar with this particular piece of the rule? Okay. More under CERCLA and EPCRA, there is a provision that allows for, let's say that you have, well, interestingly, nitrogen dioxide, NOx is on the list, but there is an exemption from CERCLA and EPCRA on notification to them of an RQ if it is continuous and stable or intermittent, where it's going to happen, okay? If it's not, and when we start talking about this, what we're talking about federally permitted releases is probably out of a refinery or out of a chemical plant, that you have releases that are, your startup shutdown malfunction, you have, some opacity issues that you may be allowed, for your 6 minutes over a certain period of time. And this is in your Clean Air Act, your Clean Water Act, your NPDES permit. And what it allows for is it provides a reduced reporting option, because you'd be going nuts and calling the damn agency all the time if you had an RQ release that was every day at 3 o'clock when you had to let off some, something to a flare, you had an SSM. And this is like, we have better things to do with our time, right? So what it provides is that if you have continuous predictable releases, this is just something your operations are pretty steady, and you can actually quantify to a certain level, where maybe you have a shutdown for 2 weeks every November and you're cleaning and doing a bunch of work where you may have an RQ release. It allows you to follow the reduced reporting option, that it becomes on an annual basis that you certify. You have these releases. It was updated in 2002. It was updated in 2002 for nitrogen oxides, and it was also updated because of grandfathered sources. And I will actually be happy to say I was involved in the reason why it got updated, because Region 7, the lovely region that I grew up with, I know it's hard to believe, but not everything comes from headquarters for EPA, okay? So you get the regional administrators who are like, hey, let's find a new initiative. What can we focus on here and get some more enforcement? Region 7 came up with the idea that if they took a look at TRI reported releases annually, obviously they're annual, if they took that, divided it by like 280 days a year, they were looking at the TRI chemicals to see if they were over RQ amounts. And if they were, and they didn't see that a facility had filed continuous release reporting reports under this reduced option, they sent you what I call the regulatory extortion letter. And the letter said, looking at your TRI submittals, we believe that you have exceeded our Q amounts for this particular chemical or chemicals, and we do not have on file any continuous release reports. Please, review and take care of this, and you owe us $11,000 per chemical. Well, I was with the auto industry then. I had 5 car plants. I had Kansas, Illinois, and Missouri. And I was the regulatory affairs manager for the big 3. And all my car plants got the letter. So, of course, my job was like, what the hell? So I call up my Missouri Chamber of Commerce, and I call the Missouri Association of Manufacturers, and call up all of my trade association buddies, and I'm like, did your members get this? What's going on? And we started making phone calls. Well, a lot of people got real paranoid, and they sent in a check. And then the rest of us are like, oh, I don't think so. And we all talked, and then we called our Washington, D.C. offices, and they petitioned EPA headquarters and said, what's going on? Headquarters didn't know anything about it. So what we basically did is we stopped the regulation from being enforced because we calculated out that, one, we didn't trigger. We had the paperwork that we were showing that we had either filed the reports or we didn't need to. We did not exceed an RQ. And then what we also found out is that small boilers that emit NOx, because they're natural gas burning boilers, that a certain small boiler at an EPA site would have emitted NOx in the RQ that they said, which I think is like 10 pounds. And we said most of your facilities would have already been subject to this as well and have violated the regulation. So you need to make these, you need to, be careful who you're pointing the finger at. So they ended up republishing guidance. One of the very important things for the guidance document that would be more applicable for you would be the fact that if you have, obviously depending on the state where you have toxics rules or you don't have air toxics rules. Louisiana has air toxics, all the taps that they have in there. You have to typically list all the HAPs that you are emitting if a state has toxic rules. If they don't, you may have a HAP emissions limit that is, less than 10 or less than 25 tons per year, or maybe you have a smaller amount that you're doing to, we would love to avoid MACT, but that doesn't always happen. But the fact is if you have VOC limitations or HAP limitations such that by back calculating you actually prevent an RQ from happening, those are considered federally permitted because they're in your Title V, they're in a construction permit, they're in your clean water permit. Those are quote unquote exempt. You do not have to file an RQ report. But if you do have emissions that are not otherwise regulated, then that is where you would look into making sure that you have filed a continuous release report. And as we said, this was challenged in court. There was the American Automobile Manufacturers, we had Forest and Paper Products, we had API. We had a real fun time with this one, but they literally pulled back all of the regulatory extortion letters. So those who got paid, of course, didn't get reimbursed, but then the ones of us who held back, they didn't pay anything. And headquarters called Region 7 and told them to cease and desist until they could issue a federal regulation modification so that it was addressed here. When we talk about that again, here's where if you have a permit limit that controls, a MACT rules will do this, but also if there's any state-specific rules or any avoidance measures that you have put in to voluntarily limit your emissions from a particular, maybe a minor source or a minor emission point, if you actually limit or eliminate releases of a hazardous substance or the EHS, they infer that those permit limits were designed to reduce that toxic substance. Thus, that is where they say that is exempt under CERCLA and EPCRA for reportable quantity. Basically, we're talking the same thing. They also do include work practices, BMPs, operational. Again, if you have a construction permit where you've put in there some voluntary measures in which to limit, whether it's production-related activities, where you're trying to minimize and limit the emissions of hazardous substance, basically an EHS or a toxic substance, a HAP, then that will actually meet the CERCLA definition and you can be considered exempt. If you exceed a permit limit, this is where we start getting into trouble. This is where you want to be able to file a continuous release report. Upset, accident, malfunctions. Of course, EPA has ruled in the last number of years due to the environmentalists having, petitioning the government. SSM, if you have a release of an SSM event and you then exceed a permit limitation under a MAC rule, that doesn't qualify. You don't get it, you don't get out of that. You basically have to eliminate those. You can't have it. You have to have a redundant system in place so that you don't have releases over your permit limits, where it used to be considered that, well, it's going to happen, it's going to be okay. So that's why EPA has modified almost every MAC rule to ensure that SSM events do not trigger permit limit exceedances. Grandfathered sources, again, they gave them a certain amount of time, but you don't get to fall on the de facto, well, we're grandfathered, we don't, we're not subject to this. It's kind of like Title V. Even if you've never had construction permits and you're still a major source, you have a Title V. Okay, you just don't have anything you have to monitor against, which is always a good thing. But more and more, you have very few grandfathered sources left anymore. They've caught them all. Precursors in gas phase emission, PM, that's another one of those when we talk about opacity limitations exceeding something there. You can have a PM crossing over facility boundaries. You've got to really be careful with this because a lot of states, and I know even in Missouri, you have particulate matter regulations, you have VOC. Well, a lot of your HAP and your toxics are also in circular releases. Those same chemicals are also can hide as a precursor, an ozone precursor, or be a precursor for something else, as well as some type of a gas phase emission, and you're still having a release. It doesn't disparage between, hi, I've got a VOC or I've got a PM issue here. You've got to look at what the chemicals are that are being released. Stable, continuous, stable in rate and quantity. If it is without interruption or it's routine, it's anticipated. Again, you have a 2-week shutdown, you have a turnover, you have something that is scheduled that you can do. You can calculate what you think the emissions are going to be, okay? You can get an idea, if you're going to be changing out valves, or you're going to be doing a whole bunch of cleaning, you're going to do some tank pressure washing, and you're going to be using some really heavy duty solvent that you don't typically emit, and it's going to be evaporating out. This is where this would be very beneficial to have evaluated.
And this is the definition that gets back to the exemption slide from before?
This is not the exemption. What this is going to do is this reduced reporting option where instead of calling them every time you have an RQ exceeds because you're doing a turnover or you're shut down, this is where you would look at, do I fulfill the reduced reporting option? And then you file the report, and it is basically just annually reported or submitted so that you're saying, yep, same thing we're doing every year.
Does this only apply to NOx and boilers, or does this also apply to like SO2 from flares?
This is any CERCLA or EPCRA release that we were just talking about from the list of lists. Okay? So this is not just, NOx was evaluated in 2002 because it is on the list at 10 pounds. But, and I'm trying to remember what it is. I think it's now 1,000 pounds that is the exemption because they actually calculated against a small boiler. But no, this is for any, when we were talking about 302 or 304 releases, where you call the NRC or you call the SERC, same list of chemicals. This is just basically the reduced reporting option so that if you've got operations that happen all the time, instead of calling 30 times a year, you get to do it. You can put it in a report, submit it annually, and then just report annually that, yep, everything stayed the same, or if there's been any changes and you've either increased or decreased, then you're fine. These are the definitions as far as what they deem to be. This is how the definition of whether it is allowed for you to take advantage of the reduced reporting option. The stable, predictable amount is emission rates are regular. Again, if you're doing some cleaning, if you're doing some work, you're doing some purging operations, doing, again, if these emissions, if these type of operations are not covered under your permit where there is a limitation on them, then you would want to take advantage of the continuous release reporting. And it may not just be something that applies. It may not be at all, but it's something to be aware of.
Interesting that continuous can be defined as intermittent.
I know, exactly.
It's continuous.
Well, one of the things, again, in the car industry, we had a purge thinner line, and sometimes there was, they would do some clean outs, but we did that at deer season. We did that at, let me see, there was a 2-week shutdown at Christmas, but no joke, it was written in the UAW contract that we were shut down for deer season. I mean, and if you had to work deer season, one, you just read totally hell being asked to do that, but they negotiated that stuff. So that was actually written in the contract. Well, if you know that you're going to be down and you've got planned, scheduled activities that are going to happen, well, okay, good, So that's where you're intermittent. You're intermittent, but you're continuous for that piece of time. Yeah, it's really interesting. Continuous releases, again, what it can include is stacks, valves, sewer discharge that aren't covered by the pretreatment standards, fugitive air sources. It does not include, again, we're now looking at SSM type activities, pipe ruptures. You don't know when you're going to have one. You don't want to have those planned. If you have them planned, then there's really a problem here. This is where you want to make sure that your permit, that these are either federally permitted, or when you have them, that again, you're hoping that you don't have these too often, but any shutdown or startup of emission units, unless there is a specific MACT regulation or you have an NSPS where it allows for that, make sure that's documented. Because again, that is something they will check on an audit, or that we would check on an audit, is if you have a release, did you take the precautions? Is it covered? And if it's covered by a CERCLA exemption, if it's covered under federally permitted release, you're nailed. Perfect, it's great, but you gotta have the documentation to support it. Control equipment failure, spills from tank unloading, loading, that happens a lot. I mean, that's just one of those things, you try to contain it or not, but again, those are the types of continuous releases that some people have tried to see, oh yeah, we have a continuous, it's like you continuously try to spill product down on the floor. I'm sorry, so you got a bad business,
Shutdown and startup of emission units allows it meets definition. So if it's planned shutdown startup during like a turnaround of a unit, would those emissions be considered? I think they're all covered under
If they're covered under MSS, then, and that is incorporated into your air permit, yes, that would be considered federally permitted. If they are not, then you'd want to file one of these reports to make sure that you have it covered.
But it would fall under continuous release.
Yeah, it would be a continuous release. However, what is more important to you is it would be covered under the federally permitted release definition. That is what you would want to hone in on. It might be continuous, but it is, more importantly, is you would want to call it a federally permitted release. If anybody asked you about that it's covered under MSS, it's covered under TCQ MSS regulations, it's incorporated in your Title V, do not ever use continuous release. Call it a federally permitted release. Anything outside of that could be a continuous release where you would then want to file the report that it's not covered under something specific under Texas regulation that is incorporated into your Title V. This is just, when we started doing Title V permits, where it's just like, everything is it federally permitted? You want to make sure everything is covered in that regulation and is covered in your construction permit, it's incorporated, because as long as it is federally enforceable, which any state construction permit program, once you have a construction permit, those conditions, those limitations are considered federally enforceable. Same thing here. You are also considered federally permitted. That allows the exemption from continuous release reporting. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Interestingly enough, if you have very similar to how you make that phone call to the NRC or to the SERC if you have a spill. What you do for continuous release reporting is you will, let's say that you decide, I've got operations that are subject to this. You make a telephone call, you do an initial written report, and you do an annual follow-up report, and you will basically, you fill out the forms and you send that in and you let them know that you are subject to the continuous release, and they will give you a number, which is a continuous emission release number, similar to what you would have if you had just a one-time spill that you're making a call to the NRC. You have what they call an SSI exceedance report, that is a statistically significant increase. When you give them the parameters of what you would typically release during this intermittent time or your shutdown or for whatever you're filing the report for, let's say that you double production the next year, you have a really, really good year. Well, that number, of course, of what is potentially going to be released is going to increase. So that's where you shift the ranges and you make a change to it, and that's what they call an SSI report, is you are changing the range for which you now have potential emissions. You know, kind of like when you put in your tier 2, you have a typical and a maximum. That's what this SSI is. This is that range on what you anticipate the amount of chemical is going to be released. Other change report is administrative and is very much in line with doing a regular CERCLA report for a release notification to the NRC. If you have more interest in this, I know that our contact information is in the back. I can send you all the lovely, helpful documentation hints on continuous releases. EPA's got some pretty decent stuff and some pretty good guidance on that, and they do a lot of good explanation, and that'd be easy. A lot of really good stuff. I mean, literally, I've got my computer. I could, send it to you like in seconds. So.
And I feel like what a lot of people miss is water treatment, and then when there's turnover within the EHS department, one of the program areas that get forgotten for some reason, the annual notification. I've seen that happen a lot.
You're attached to your code.
That's right.
Um,
I got a tail.
I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but one thing that I just thought of that you missed that I didn't mention was when we were talking about 302 reporting, when you bring on a extremely hazardous substance over its TPQ and you do the one-time notification. So there's actually two parts to that, and that's what chemical did you bring on that's over its TPQ, and who's your emergency planning coordinator. And if you have a change in emergency planning coordinator, then you're also required to submit a notification within the 30 days that you've had a change in emergency coordinator.
Right.
And give them a new phone number.
Right.
So that's an audit finding we have.
We have a client who has changed their people quite a few times, and we're like going, my gosh, please hold on. We actually filed all of their tier 2s, filed everything, and a week later they changed plant managers, they changed emergency coordinators, and it's like Lauren had to go back and redo all the submittals. And we're like, couldn't you have done this before March 1st, but.
Right.
But it's 30 days.
Isn't it?
I believe it's 30 days.
It's 30 days. Okay. But I'll relook that up and let you know if it's not. But I'm pretty sure it's 30 days.
I'm going to have you start the handing of the microphones.
Yeah, right. Did anybody have any questions?
Do you have examples of these reports that you have to submit, like the
Yeah.
304 report and stuff?
So EPA, so for 302, the one that we were just talking about, EPA actually has a template online.
Okay.
And it's super short, and it's just 2 sentences saying, I have sulfuric acid in excess of 1,000 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
This is my emergency planning contact. His phone number is, his 24-hour phone number is blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
And that's all it is. And then, I'm sure there's templates for.
There's templates, yeah.
So for 304, that's can be a little more state specific.
Right.
So I'd recommend for 304 looking more to see if your state has templates.
Look under the emergency management program. or, type in at the state level your state emergency response or emergency management
Okay.
association, because it is true.
Some states have forms,
Some
specific
states have
forms.
Specific forms that they want you to fill out and go, and that's what's kind of.
From the list of topics on your slide, it looked like that can be a very canned
Yeah.
report that,
Yeah.
Transcends state, but
It
if they're
can, but
specific.
again, some states, what you try to do, what we've actually done before is, we've got a couple of states that we kind of make our own template up,
Okay.
put the best of everything in there, and then it just kind of can be used for anybody.
Right.
And the NRC will be federal, so what you do for them is consistent for everybody, but for the state submission, you'd want to look it up,
And anything
especially in
on the
Texas.
release will be federal, so that will be, and as I said, I can send you the guidance on that, because it's actually got examples, and it's got a nice guidance, and it's got good Q&A in there, and how you can go about calculating the thresholds.
Any other questions? Okay. So kind of in that same vein, Section 311 is our safety data sheets. So it used to be MSDSs, now starting in 2015, SDSs. I know, right? And so this will be a federal rule. And the only instance I can think of where we would have different requirements at the state level would be, we typically take care of this reporting requirement through, most companies will take care of it through Tier 2 submissions. And certain states, if they have an online Tier 2 program, will want you to make updates for Section 311 through their online program. So they may not want you to mail anything in, but more so just do it through your online account. We're starting to see that more and more. Section 312 is our Tier 2, which we've kind of been talking about, and then Section 313 is our TRI toxic release inventory. All right, so Section 311, if you were to look up our 29 CFR requirement, as well as the 40 CFR Section 311, it's a very short section. There's not a whole lot to it, just a couple paragraphs. And really all it's asking you to do is when you bring chemicals on site that are hazardous, so this is going to be a much broader definition than our extremely hazardous substance, which is kind of what we spent the last section talking about. This will be anything with an OSHA hazard. So that could be most things, really.
Where it says OSHA has, well, it's corrosive or flammable or combustible, or the acute, chronic, which is basically any irritation whatsoever, or that, what is it, Texas is pretty much that if there's any number in anything, even if it's NFPA, if there's a 1, then it's got some hazard with it.
Yeah, so this will be your OSHA acute, chronic, reactive, fire. That's all I can think of. Anyway, and SDSs have really gotten a lot better in the last couple of years. So typically, if you just look at your SDS and scroll to Section 15, which is where it covers regulatory reporting, it'll actually have a line item called 311, 312, and it'll list the hazards for that product. And it, as we said, so the TPQ for all these hazardous chemicals is 10,000 pounds.
One of the things, especially with MSDS, and as Lauren said, more and more MSDSs, and I can't, I'm still getting to the SDS, MSDS story. The fact that there's some that are really good out there, and then there's some that are really horrendous. It's one of those best management practices is what we continually find, and we just had this happen to us, is we actually did the Tier 2 and the TRI for one of our clients. Well, they gave us MSDSs of, yeah, here's all the products we're using, and we evaluated them, everything is great. We did their Tier 2, we did their TRI, and then we did a multimedia compliance audit late in 2014. There was another MSDS, there was a newer MSDS that we had not been given. And it had different percentages of constituents, hazardous chemical constituents in there, and we're like, we'd never seen it. And it changed the calculations where, luckily, it didn't trip TRI, but it got a lot closer to 25,000 pounds than we had before. So what we are trying to advise the client now is they're going to a electronic MSDS, database online, is clean up your MSDSs. Put, if, I know you gotta keep the darn things forever and a day, but put the obsolete MSDSs or things that aren't being used, put them in binders that say obsolete MSDSs or something, because that's one of the things that we can only do. If we're hard to take a look at everything, it's very laborious to go through that. But if you got 1,000 MSDSs that you're not even using those products anymore, put them away someplace so that that's not what is currently being looked at. And again, if you don't see something in section 15, then you need to look at section 3. And sometimes you can just kind of glance through there and it starts talking about strong oxidizer, strong this, that, or the other. And you kind of know when you look at an SDS, this stuff's hazardous. And guess what? You're not going to be penalized for putting another chemical on a tier 2 form.
Yeah, I'd say the other part of that is typically the only products that I would consider to be not OSHA hazardous would either have to have nothing listed in Section 2 chemical composition or physically say the sentence, this is not a regulated OSHA hazardous chemical. Yeah.
Isn't there something about chemicals that are commercially available by over the counter?
Yeah, so there's a lot of exemptions, which we'll get to with the tier 2. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of exemptions that you would want to take advantage of that would still apply. The same exemptions that we'll talk about for tier 2 also apply for this section 311. Hey.
That's a lot of
Psychic.
So here's our list of exempt chemicals. Hazardous wastes regulated by EPA, consumer products, which is what you just mentioned, solids with no exposure potential, wood, metals, food, drugs, tobacco, cosmetics, alcoholic, R&D, lab chemicals. So we've got a lot of food and beverage clients that get to take advantage of the food exemption. Yeah. Pineapple. And then a lot of people will get hung up on the article exemption, which would be the solids with no exposure potential. And that's kind of where the confusion regarding lead acid batteries stems from, is where do you draw that line? And it is a little blurry, but particularly for the instance of lead acid batteries, EPA has gone through great lengths to publish lots of different documents, and even states now saying, we do not consider this an article. It requires reporting. And there's even additional guidance under OSHA as to what OSHA considers to be an article, and they have some good examples listed there.
And TRI specifically has an article exemption. This exemption is not really an article exemption. It is solids that don't have an exposure. If you've got
That's true.
You've got steel beams, steel rod, alloys, and you've got them sitting out, out in the skeleton pile just to, sit there for a while. And at some point in time, you're going to bring them in and you're going to start cutting and abrading and brazing and doing all that work. If it's sitting out there, nothing's happening to it, it's just sitting out in the pile, fine. It doesn't have an exposure potential. When you bring it in-house, let's say that you've got 1 million pounds of steel out there that you use for various and sundry work inside, for platforms or anything else. As long as it's sitting out in the pile out there, fine, no problem. Once you bring it in and you start working on it and messing with it, where you're generating fumes or you're doing some abrasion or brazing or abrading or grinding or anything like that, now you got to start taking a look at it that there could be potential exposure, and that's where you may have crossed the line to say, now I am processing something such that it is now inside in my chemical inventory in-house, inside my facility, and now there's a potential for exposure. And that is one of the things that's really careful, like we have a client that has a glue gun, hot pellets, they buy them in bulk. Well, if they're sitting in bags, there's no exposure to them. They're not doing it until you start putting them into the pot to melt them, and then you have a potential exposure issue. So again, the pellets themselves are not hazardous, so they don't go on the tier 2. But once they put in a whole big tote of it, or super sack into a pot and start melting it where there is potential issues, that amount that's in the pot that's sitting in that tank would be considered under the tier 2 reg.
And the good news is, for instance, with the example regarding metals, so we bring in our metals and we start cutting and grinding them. EPA has issued guidance documents to the effect that what we would consider against our tier 2 threshold is just the fume or dust and particulate. So you don't need to include that whole big metal beam. You can just include and then typically you'd be under, and you'd just want to document that you're using that exemption. R&D lab chemicals is another really good exemption to use. And the consumer products is another really good one when you consider like your finished products. So once you've created your finished product and it's packaged and assembled, you don't need to incorporate that in most instances. Okay, so you're similar to what we'll get into with 312. This reporting requirement, when you have a new chemical that's on site and exceeds our 10,000 pound threshold, you then have 60 days to make a notification to the LEPC, your CERC, and your local fire department, who are the same people that you submit your tier 2 reports to. And EPA has said that submitting our 312 reports can take care of this requirement, but that is an annual report, so you'd still want to be taking a look at what new items are coming on site, because you do have that 60-day requirement. Any questions on 311?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I just finished it.
Oh, nice.
I'm still, it's in review right now. But, so, in Texas, because I just started working here not too long ago, so this is my first tier 2. We just have, we evaluate every 30 days if it's an EHS containing chemical, but every 60 days we just have a task that you just go through, and everything that we've brought in that is hazardous but not EHS, we just add it and do a new tier 2 submit update. So if you do that for something that's I think the big one for us is chemical cleaning, where you bring, and every time they do chemical cleaning of a different process, they use completely different chemicals. So they bring them on, they're on for a week, and I do the tier 2 submit update in that period, and then they're off again. And now I'm at the annual report, and I'm like, do I really need to include these things that are definitely already off site? So when you're doing that annual report, if you're doing periodic updates, are you still looking at reporting anything that was on site
At any one time during that calendar year?
Yes.
During that calendar year. Okay.
And so the way that you would kind of show that it was a temporary chemical is it's required to list the number of days it was on site. So if you wanted to fill that out, specifically, that's kind of how you would show it. But yeah, you would have to include all of them.
Okay.
It's a pain, but especially as you said, if it's coming on and it's somebody been there that long, but it is at any one time with the definition, if it is on site at any one time in excess of that threshold, the notification needs to be made and needs to be reported on that.
Yeah.
I am still blown away. It's just I kind of like your idea. If you have it on there, wouldn't you want them to know immediately? I mean, if you report that you had this at one time, anytime on site, it's well, what are they going to do about it? But I don't know.
Yeah, with me, it's just, in the past, it was just a different system in other states, and with this one where you report it immediately, and you do a whole new tier 2, basically,
Right.
Every 60, 30 or 60 days,
Right.
and then you send it in, and you say, this is what we have on it, and then the annual comes around, it's what is the benefit of...
I actually like this. I actually like your idea that if you're bringing something on, that it's immediately notified, because that might be the thing that's well, what if there's a problem? I mean, part of my issue is, I guess this is looking in because, you know, I've got nothing better to do with my time, I guess, to think about these things. But it's kind of like, I guess that they're assuming that once you have a lot of the stuff on site, that it's typically there year to year, that for the fire department or other people to know what you had on the prior year, it's kind of like, well,
All those little chemicals and stuff.
it just, you know, it's kind of like, well, if there's an emergency, it's like, they're not gonna know. I mean, my whole thing is if there's an emergency, if right now we have an emergency and we didn't store this stuff on here in 2014 and we haven't filed the 2015, we haven't filed anything, I guess the whole thing comes about is you make that notification to them. But I mean, if we had an accident today and they don't know that you have that stuff on site, then you've kind of taken away the whole, you know, meaning of the whole plan of why you had the tier 2 in the first place, because it isn't required to be filed yet, other than that 60-day notification. So it's, you know, with what you're filing at the state level every 30 days, probably even smarter. But it almost seems like you should, if you have to file those the way you're doing it, would almost be nice to not have to do the annual
Yeah.
report.
Yeah. No, it's very true. All right, so moving on, section 312 is our tier 2 report, which is due March 1st. So, woo, kind of in the thick of it. And so tier 2s are going to be the one part of EPCRA that's most heavily regulated by state. So you can have different requirements for each state, what they want you to submit, who they want you to submit it to, how many dollars you have to pay in fees. For oil and gas and various sectors, they can even have their own more stringent requirements. And kind of like we talked for Louisiana, New Jersey, they can have their own special threshold requirements. But especially in recent years, states have gotten a lot better about including really good guidance on what they're looking for, and most states will typically have a manual that's pretty straightforward and lets you know exactly kind of what they're looking for. So that's been nice. So Miss, do you want to talk about tier 1 form?
Yeah.
I don't do many tier 1s.
These young people, I tell you. Back in the old days, they had a tier 1 form, which was, this is really much where EPCRA just came about. The tier 1 was just like, yeah, we have a chemical and yeah, it's over here. You didn't have near the data and information that's requested as far as the containers and specifics about the chemical and the whole. It was hazardous. They just wanted to know the bare bones that we have it at our facility. I mean, literally tier 1s were a very simplified form. They did not ask for, you know, you didn't have the GPS coordinates and all the DMV information. I mean, you had it contacted for the person. You had just a little bit about the chemical, but it didn't go into all the characteristics, all the containers, all the location, you know, site map, any of that stuff. It was much more minimal. The tier 2 form is what people go by, and is being updated even again. They're looking at it, providing even more information. So, so the fact is this is one of those where if it was up to me, and I probably will, I don't know anybody using the tier 1 form, so as far as I'm concerned, I would take the slide and update it, just not even talk about a tier 1. So that'll probably happen after, you know, but, yeah. Tier 2 form, that is what you have. That is the main form that's got all the information, and the EPA is getting pretty tight on this one. They want to continue to get even more information on the tier 2 forms, because one of the things that Lauren and I have talked about, and since I did the Homeland Security work, I'm sure you guys being down here, the West Texas fertilizer incident that was a couple of years ago in April. You know, the fact of the matter is you had a family-owned fertilizer company with hundreds of thousands of pounds of ammonia and ammonium nitrate. No tier 2 was filed. They said that, oh, it got filed at the last minute, you know, after the explosion or just beforehand. But the CFACS, the Homeland Security Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, are also initially based. This is a security regulation, but it's based on certain list of chemicals, some really nasty stuff, and it's a lot like, you know, your CERCLA and EPCRA list or your TRI listing. And the fact of the matter is, if the fire department had known about that, they probably would have made the rush that they made gotten killed, because literally across the street from the plant was a hotel that they were having firefighter training. And when they heard the first explosion and saw a fire, they all got up, because they, you know, it's in their DNA, they all went over to go help. Well, they all died. You know, the plant was leveled, the town was leveled, there was so much damage. Well, the problem is they had no idea what was over there. And so you've got OSHA violations, you've got EPA violations, they've got Homeland Security violations. They have sued the chemical company that delivered the tankers that are located in, that company is in Illinois. I mean, there is a lot of problem. Obviously, the company is out of business. But what is happening is, with the forms, they are really starting to hit hard on making sure they're accurate. And what they are starting to find out is more states are starting to do a little bit of auditing, or at least making sure that what you're saying is in your tier 2 is there. Fire departments typically come by once a year for insurance purposes that they'll look at. That's where you want to let them know when some new stuff's coming on board, and just in general, where do you have everything stored. So it's again really maintaining that accuracy. And that stemmed a lot of why, with the West Fertilizer incident, that EPA needs to be talking to OSHA, who needs to be talking to Homeland Security, who's talking to all the other, to all the different agencies. And that's when a presidential order came about, I think, May of last year, and that's where they're all coordinating together. It's the reason why Homeland Security is getting more involved, because they now know that there's an RMP and a PSM, database out there. Like, crap. There's a lot of chemicals that are the same on there that's also on our chemicals of interest, so we can enforce against that, and there's a lot more of that coming as far as enforcement and auditing by EPA regions on RMP and PSM.
Yeah, and kind of in that same vein, I would say recently, but I guess it was about a year ago, even the New York Times actually published an article on how the government should pay closer attention to Tier 2 and how this is really a safety issue, and kind of calling for, why haven't we done more with this regulation, when it can impact safety? So there's really been a lot of discussion on it. And just last year, so this will be the second year, we had an increase in all the reporting requirements. So the required latitude and longitude, you probably noticed your form got longer. Do you submit an RMP is now a question, as Miss was saying, to kind of tie that all together more from an enforcement standpoint. And in the past 2 years, I feel like even the LEPCs and county levels have gotten really involved, sending emails back asking for additional not required information, or increasing the request for a site plan, that kind of thing. So it's kind of an exciting time in the life of the Tier 2 right now. Yeah, so our Tier 2 form is what's going to give you, so moving on from 311. So 311 is really just saying what chemicals you have on site in excess of 10,000 pounds, and here's my safety data sheet. 312 is going to give them a lot more information on your company, your contact information, and those chemicals. What's in them, where are they stored, in what types of containers, all the way from your large tanks to your 5-gallon jugs is a container type option. Location of the chemical, site layout, and the range of your max and average. And then depending on the state, now states within your Tier 2 submit software can have additional requirements. I don't think there's really any for Texas other than your TXT2 number. But like in Massachusetts, they'll want to know who's your chemical carrier, what's the name of the trucking company, what's their route. It's, it can be a lot of additional state requirements. So the keys for Tier 2 reporting: applicability, accuracy, and updates. As you were saying, it sounds like you guys have a really great program in place to do updates throughout the year. I'd say that's much further along than what we see most times.
Well, we have a lot of chemicals.
Yeah.
Change out, so it makes sense. Just being
It's just nice to hear.
I was going to say, yeah, even with larger facilities. So that's great. And that's kind of what the ideal system would be, is that you're actually evaluating things within those certain number of day requirements so that you can catch the updates and then make sure that they're incorporated onto your Tier 2. So that would be new chemicals stored, when your existing chemical first exceeds a reporting threshold, if you bring on a couple extra totes more than you normally would, and a significant change in information regarding a reported chemical. And as we were saying, now a lot of times these can be physically updated during the year online. So not for Texas, but for a lot of other states like Georgia and most facilities that use, I don't know if you've heard of ePlan, but a lot of states are switching to the ePlan program, and that lets you update online periodically throughout the year.
Be nicer.
I think everybody should use it, but
I assume Tier 2 Submit is just one of those softwares that was like an early version.
it's been around a long time.
It's terrible.
Yes.
Exactly.
But
Web-enabled, either download the software every year.
Yeah.
Yep.
It'd be nice to make it web enabled like they've done.
Yeah.
I know.
You know, it's like North Dakota has a better system now.
Oh, no.
Acting IT approval to download Tier 2 every year.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh,
Yeah.
my God.
Because it's a download, and
Yeah.
you can't go do downloads without IT blessing it.
Right, because it's like you don't want to be.
So that is a good thing to mention. You do need to download the software every year because those changes, especially state-specific changes, get incorporated into that software each year. So you wouldn't want to be missing out on that.
So is it like client software like ECMPS, or is that kind of way different than that?
I can show you
No.
later, but it's it basically just looks like, you know, a normal software, and then there's kind of like tabs that you click on to go through. So there's your company information that'll be consistent from year to year, and then your chemical information has your storage locations, and that's more of like what you update and add chemicals. But it does let you import your previous files from year to year.
Okay.
So it's not like you lose your data.
I was just saying, because I was still around, it's more like an access database.
Okay.
Looking type
Yeah.
thing. But it needs to be.
At least it's purple. It's got some pizzazz.
TurboTax to do Tier 2.
It's it.
Gotcha.
Well, and you don't have to worry about it crash. I mean, I'm not.
That's true. It's very
There's that.
Yeah.
stable.
You just have the online, like, state databases. It's like, oh, it just crashed.
Oh, I remember when
What
TRI
happened?
2 years ago, when it crashed like the week before, July 1st, and like EPA actually gave everybody a day because it was, they couldn't get the system up, and we were freaking out.
Yeah, and speaking of, so with Tier 2 Submit, you can either export a zip file or the .t2s file. And some states do specify what type of file they want, and they'll email you back saying, I don't want your zip file, I want your .t2s file. And even counties, as they're getting more into it, will request certain types of files. So just something to keep in mind. That's kind of something that's been changing lately. And I think Texas, you can submit either one. I always submit .t2s, but I think you can submit.
We do too. Yeah, I think you can. I just went to their.
Most people will never kick back your zip file. If anything, most people will not kick back a .t2s file. So I always just submit those as opposed to the zip. So yeah, updates to the Tier 2 report are due within 90 days of exceeding the threshold or obtaining significant new information for a chemical. And there's no minimum time limit, as we were talking about, for material exceeding thresholds that's stored on your site during the calendar year. So this slide is going to this first bullet point is going to swing back to kind of what we were talking about, the safety impacts. So when we do a Tier 2 for the very first time with a new client, we like to kind of start out with, why is this important? Because I think keeping that in mind as you're walking your facility and trying to do a comprehensive Tier 2 may make it hit home and help you be a little bit more comprehensive. So these reports are really designed to paint a comprehensive picture of the facility and all of its hazards. And the reason being is that we're submitting it to the fire department and our emergency planning facilities so that when if we do have an accident in the future, that's what they're going to look at. And it's going to help them know, how to strategize. If you've got tanks of flammables or totes of flammables or explosives located, in the east corner, well, then we're going to enter from the north entrance. Or if we know that we've got, you know, a giant storage location here, let's enter from over here. And, you know, what are the effects of that chemical? Acute, chronic, all of those types of things. So it kind of gives them a pretty good snapshot of what they'd be walking into in the event of an emergency. And especially with adding things like latitude and longitude into the required information, that's something that I know fire departments and LEPCs have expressed as one of the crucial pieces that they like to have. And as we've switched to ePlan and more of the electronic type things, that allows, it's a lot more accessible for them and makes it a lot more relevant and frequently used because they have softwares that they can just upload it while they're driving to the scene or that kind of thing.
I actually got called by EPA when we submitted an RFP plan update. And I said, you need to go in and change your GPS coordinates because it's not coming up on the order correctly. And we're like, really? So we went in and changed it, you know. He was like, thanks. I mean, they're looking at it. And again, you know, you got better tools, so they're using them. But they've been tasked to, as Laura was saying, they're being tasked because the public is starting to get, when you have these accidents, it's like, we need to know where it is, and you need to update it. It isn't, you know, she and I try to make sure when we have these discussions, these are living documents. These are not something that, you know, you throw in the binder or throw on the shelf and you're done with it. It changes. Being mindful, you know, when maintenance tells you, or the process guys, or we're putting in new construction and you got to shift the satellite storage over to something else, you really want to make sure. EPA, and I actually have a letter that Region 7 sent out. It was more of a voluntary thing, but they have talked about adding hazardous waste to Tier 2, at least so that you notify what you're storing, which makes some sense. If I have waste methanol or I have methanol, they're still nasty, they're still hazardous, and they're still flammable. So what does it make a difference? But, you know, and you've got that exemption, you know, you have that like fertilizer retail facility exemption, you know, under Tier 2. You know, where it's just like, guess what? That basically means that they don't know where the ammonium nitrate is, so it can be stolen, it can be picked up, and that's kind of where, you know, that's where the Homeland Security stuff goes in. It's making sure. What the Chicago Tribune had an article that was talking about, even like what Lauren had said with the New York Times, that they start taking a look at facilities and we're finding out how blatantly inaccurate the Tier 2s were and the site locations of where the chemicals were stored. And just, they hadn't been updated in years. And again, dangerous, because that's, you know, when I look at it and when you yell at the lawyers who are like, well, we're under 10,000 pounds. I'm like, you're at 9,800, shut up, you know. It's one of those, it isn't for you. That's the whole thing is, this is for the protection of the emergency responders. So it's keeping that in mind. And I guess the ease of it is now, because we do have it online, once you filled out a Tier 2, unless you're drastically changing your operations or chemicals or stuff, it's in there. Why not? What hurts? You know, what hurts?
And interestingly, I know the last part of EPCRA is community right to know. And in the past couple of years, when I think of community right to know, I think more of TRI data getting published each year. But now 312s are getting published in a sense on state websites. So like Oklahoma, after you've submitted, you can go and it's a GIS of the state and you can see your facility, like little bits about it, you know, just that increased awareness of the regulation.
I know when I was at the Texas one, their little training, they said that they'd had a lot of increase in you have to do a public request of the information right now. I don't think they actually like publish it anywhere.
Yeah, you'd have to request it.
Yeah, but they had seen an increase, they said, of private individuals requesting.
Interesting.
Yeah. The internet is a political thing. There's not much to hide.
But yeah, so, and it's another regulation where if you're doing auditing or you do corporate internal EHS audits, Tier 2 is a pretty easy one to have findings. Either missed chemicals or missed storage locations. So really the key is just to be comprehensive and aware and check in with your maintenance people and know the right people to talk to or delegate to. So some common errors that we see: unknown or incorrect storage locations within the facility, noting tanks of chemicals but missing the smaller denominations like your totes and your drums, addition of new equipment, and expansion of processes that may happen from year to year. And another new one that I'd add to this is off-site warehouses. So if you have an off-site warehouse where you would physically be like, it's a leased space, but you are operating those forklifts, or you are, a little more involved than they come and pick up your storage. But that's something where you'd want to look into, do I need to be filing a Tier 2 for that off-site facility? And I know Texas in particular has published guidance on that too.
What the hell did I do? Uh-oh. Okay, this is... tell me to quit.
Another common error would be, this is typically going to be for smaller facilities. So like for you all, it sounds like you have so many cleaning chemicals that you'd exceed for EHSs like sulfuric acid, pretty easily. But another one would be, if you're close to the EHS reporting threshold, just making sure that you've incorporated all of those cleaning chemicals, And if you aggregate, are you over that TPQ of 500 pounds? And that kind of thing.
Have you heard anything, somebody mentioned this to me the other day, about
not
Yeah.
screw you up.
No, you're fine.
Compressed gases having a different threshold. And so I don't know if it's a state requirement.
Compressed gases.
That are not,
Here you go.
not flammable or H2S or anything like that. Well,
A different threshold?
yeah, I was like, I sat through the state training, and for Texas, I didn't hear anything about a lower threshold, so I don't know if,
So they have that in California.
okay.
So California, you do so it may be state specific. I don't know of that for federal, but I know specifically in California, they have different requirements for solids and liquids and compressed gases.
It would have to be, because the state hasn't changed anything yet. Yeah, there must be something that's changed, as you said, there must be state.
But I'll look it up.
Yeah.
I was thinking it rang a bell, and then I'm thinking it's ringing a bell because we're doing a Tier 2 for California right now. And I know that was a...
And I know they've got their own array.
I mean, their whole system is really different than the rest of the country anyway. But specifically to compressed gases, I know they have a different threshold. But yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I'll look it up.
I know Texas has like a different, for EHS, it's like if the threshold is 500, it doesn't matter because their threshold is 250 for an EHS. Right?
Mm-hmm.
But like I was like, I never really think about that.
Huh.
I think we report all of our compressed gases anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Because we have so many of everything.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'll have to look it up. I'll look it up. All right. Okay, so I guess before we get into exemptions, because there's a number of exemptions, do we want to break?
Yeah, is it 10?
It's 9:55. Okay.
Now, I'm just gonna ask questions because I'll get going. It's like, am I talking too fast? Okay. It was like we had this little training class and we were talking, and it was funny because the trainer was like going, do you know, and he was talking about the differences in men and women and how things, and it's like that women talk, what is it? For when women communicate, they use like 8 different parts of their brain, and when men do, they use 1. And they were talking about, which is typically why women speak faster, because they're using multiple parts of their brain. And then it was just like, so I was like going, oh God, I tend to start talking fast when I get going, so I figured I might as well ask.
I think part that's regional too.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Slower or faster than
Right.
where you're from.
They don't have a drawl, so.
Are you from St. Louis?
No. I was born in Texas, then lived in Kansas City for my first 10 years, basically, and then been in St. Louis the rest of the time. So I call myself native St. Louis, but I remember that when I was in a German class in 6th grade, in my or 7th grade, my teacher said that I had this Kansas drawl, and I'm like, there's a Kansas drawl? I had no idea what he was talking about, but
I was always raised to believe that St. Louis was accent neutral.
yeah.
And then I got to college and everybody was like, you are not accent neutral. And apparently we're like really harsh on our vowels.
Pardon me?
They all consider that the Midwest.
Yeah.
People from Tennessee commented on your accent.
They did.
It's interesting.
Midwest.
They said we were like really like, meh, like, mom. And I was like,
You know what, I know, and I feel it too, but when they
Yeah.
talk to seven,
And that's very
of course,
different.
then
I mean,
you
that's
get the whole
Yeah.
thing, you know, and you're just fly by.
yeah.
The Midwest,
And then,
yeah. but
yeah,
it's-
I have friends who
heard
live in
that-
St. Louis now.
All right. So
Start singing.
we are still in tier 2, due March 1st, coming up. And this is going to be our regulation that's on storage. So just to reiterate, this is storage. And TRI, when we get to TRI, is going to be usage and throughputs, so 2 different numbers. And when we're calculating what needs to be included on our tier 2, we have a variety of exemptions that we want to make sure that we use to the fullest, but not inappropriately. So
That was really well stated.
I've seen it both ways. So the very first one is going to be motor vehicles, and this would be under the definition of facility. Hazardous chemicals present in mobile sources used only for the facility are not exempt, e.g. sulfuric acid and lead acid batteries in forklifts, but chemicals in delivery trucks parked temporarily are exempt. So the way I usually like to think about this is kind of like industrial equipment. So your car batteries, not going to need to worry about, but our forklifts, you're not going to have those outside the facility. That's going to be more industrial. DOT transportation exemption. Substances or chemicals in transportation or being stored incident to transportation are exempt. And this is one that I've seen a lot, and a really good one to keep in mind. So this will be pipelines. So our pipelines are going to be regulated by DOT, so those get to be exempt. Breakout tanks associated with the pipelines, and rail cars and tankers containing hazardous materials that are located at a facility and under shipping papers. And as we discussed, there's no article exemption like TRI. It's going to be a little bit different. Industrial lead acid batteries are not article exempt and must be considered. And this is per memorandum that was first issued by OSHA and then subsequently elaborated on and issued by EPA. And essentially, we're not going to get to exempt lead acid batteries because in certain scenarios they could get hit by a forklift and have the potential to create an exposure to workers. So that's kind of the basis of their argument there, is that you could have a sulfuric acid release from a forklift battery. So sulfuric acid is an extremely hazardous substance with a TPQ of 1,000 pounds. But as we discussed, the tier 2 threshold is going to be 500 pounds or the TPQ, whichever is lower. So sulfuric acid for tier 2 is going to have that 500 pound threshold.
And it's just the sulfuric acid in the battery. You need to add the 500 pounds or do you put the lead
Great question.
in your calculation?
So it's just going to be the sulfuric acid, and there's a couple different ways that you can use to calculate that number. And basically, under EPCRA, what's going to fly is going to be your best readily available information. So in Texas, they've issued guidance that the best way to estimate this would be to get the weight of the battery and take the MSDS and apply that sulfuric acid content times the weight of the battery. And in Texas, they say if your MSDS doesn't break it out, or if you can't find that number, a good rule of thumb would be 18% sulfuric acid. So, and sometimes they'll give you an electrolyte number, but that isn't necessarily 100% sulfuric acid, so you'd have to kind of see on a case-by-case basis.
So ballpark 18% of the weight of the battery is the acid itself?
Yes.
You can, and Lauren, I've got some documents that I got from years ago when I started doing all this stuff where, depending on the model of the battery, I've got some reference documents where you can actually look it up about how much actual sulfuric is in that model of a battery versus how
And
much lead.
nowadays, your battery vendor should be able to provide you with a tier 2 report
Okay.
pre-calculated.
Right.
So that wasn't happening so much in past years, but I've been seeing it a lot more in the past couple of years, that if you request it, most battery vendors will give you a tier 2 printout.
And then you can put that in your, put that in your backup documentation, which is nice to do.
So if you can, you can try to put the brunt of that on the vendor. And then, so another good question with that. So if you had a scenario where, say, you only had 2 batteries. So let's say we had 2 1,000-pound batteries, and we're using that 18%. We've triggered for sulfuric acid. So in that scenario, on our tier 2, we would have a line item for sulfuric acid. Because,
That triggered it?
yeah. Well, 18, so 180 plus 180. Oh, no, not yet.
Not yet.
Just kidding. So pretend that you had over 500 pounds.
You see here.
That's right.
That's right.
So, so anyway, if you exceed for the 500 pounds, you'd report that as a line item. But the aggregate weight of all of your batteries may not be over 10,000 pounds yet, which is why you have to write that as a line item for sulfuric acid. If your aggregate battery weight is over 10,000 pounds, you could just do a line item for batteries and then break out the sulfuric acid as an EHS component of the battery when you're filling out the physical form.
You could actually just report lead acid batteries. You click the EHS button with sulfuric acid and then move on there.
So if you have over 10,000 pounds in weight of batteries, then you're good to go. But a lot of people forget that you can have way less than 10,000 pounds of batteries and still need to report for sulfuric acid. So you can have a couple scenarios there. So yeah, as we discussed, there's a lot of different lead acid batteries on site: forklifts, jig lifts, scissor lifts, all those types of things. Emergency generators. All right, and so the most important part of Tier 2, I guess, and the best way to remember what this reporting requirement is really about, is going to be that we're reporting mixtures that exceed based on their maximum storage. And when you're generating that threshold calculation, you have a couple options, which is kind of what we were getting at a little bit in talking about lead acid batteries, which is going to be that you can either report by chemical. So let's say you want to just report sulfuric acid, and then underneath that entry you could have lead acid batteries, wastewater treatment chemicals, so you're reporting by the physical chemical. Or more commonly, you'll see facilities report by MSDS product name. So that would be taking the individual product, seeing if it exceeds the 10,000 pound threshold, and having that product name as your chemical name.
And you have to, remember for EHSs, you have to pull that out to see if you've hit the 500 pounds, because you may have sulfuric acid in batteries, and then you may have sulfuric acid in other mixtures, or maybe even carrying it, by itself. So for an EHS, you have to pull that out and aggregate that to see if you've if you've hit the threshold. Whereas, as Lauren was saying, we've had several where we have a bunch of inks or glues or paints. They're differing in colors, but they have the same basic background, and in most cases, so they're flammable or combustible, or they have something in them that makes them that way. So it's just, you can just report paints, and then you can click mixture, and then typically what you would do, if there's no EHS in there, fine, but you can just click off the chronic, acute, flammable, whatever that goes in there, because it's all the same stuff.
What's
that
that?
reduces your line items of having, like at the car plant, we had 200 colors. And it's like paint, clear coat, base coat, you know.
You don't have any sound issues?
No?
No? Okay. Just check.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So yeah, to kind of get into the concept of grouping would be, you know, as opposed to listing each product name, which is maybe what you've been doing for the rest of your tier 2, when you get to lubricants, you know, maybe you have 20 different types of Lubrizol, Calsol, all these different types. You can just make an entry called lubricant, check flammability and acute and mixture and liquid and move on. And maybe, and in a lot of ways, it's also designed to be easier for you, but also more comprehensive. So maybe you only have a couple drums of a certain type of lubricant, but when you aggregate them all together, they're basically the exact same, you know, chemical component, and you'd be over the 10,000 pounds. So incorporating them that way. But yeah, most commonly we'll see grouping with lubricants and paints. And EHS, just making sure that you're calculating that threshold throughout the facility. So it's not just that you have to have 500 pounds in batteries or 500 pounds in your chem treat. You just have to have 500 pounds facility-wide to exceed for that sulfuric acid. And being consistent when reporting the single EHS or the mixture containing the EHS, which is what we just discussed, doing it by chemical name or product name, just being consistent once you've decided how you're going to report. Yeah.
So specifically, like catalysts, we
Uh-huh.
have catalysts everywhere, and they won't have any like EH&S chemicals involved in, say, oxides or something
Right.
like that. And they're all like a little bit different, but if they're chemically the same or they have the same hazards on the MICS, we'll
I'd group
group
them.
them together.
I'd group them.
But then we have some that's like, is it? Oh, I mean, some that are below the threshold that we're like, okay, we're not gonna toward this. None of the individual chemical components are on the EH&S list. Like the MSD says, there's no hazards.
So are they, are
And it's
those
below
not-
10,000?
Yeah, are those, so they're not hazardous? You have some catalysts that are hazardous, but they don't have EHS in
Yeah.
them. And then you have some that are non-EHS and they're deemed non-hazardous?
Yeah.
Okay.
So and
Then
those we don't
yeah.
count. But then
Right.
we have some that are just, they're a little bit different. They're not EH&S, but they are below that 10%. I think there's been some question on how much should we feel like we should group those together. Like,
So the way I typically see it done is most facilities where I'm seeing catalyst is they're going to do it by individual catalyst. So they'll report whichever individual catalyst exceeds. And I think if you would rather group all the catalysts, then I would think you'd just want to group all of them. But it's not.
we tend to kind of, we're not very like regimented about how we do it, but a lot of times it's like if it's the same manufacturer and they're kind of in a series, like even if they're not listed on the same MSDS, it's like different formulations of each one with the same general hazards. But it's like, okay, you know, this one is from Accents and this one's from Accents. They're basically both aluminum oxide catalysts, and they have the same like hazards. We'll group those together, and then we'll have one that's also from Accents that has aluminum oxide and like cobalt in it,
Mhm.
and that one will be.
So you have flexibility, but I would say the most important thing would be to document why you're doing what you're doing and just be able to show that there was thought put into it.
These and not grouping these others.
I mean, and like as you said, to borrow, if you've got, my whole thing is, and if I have a lot of stuff that's, you know, that it's electronic where it's a PDF, I'll take a look at it and then I'll add a text box at the top right-hand corner on it that says, I'll put the date, I'll put my initials, and then I'll put no tier 2, no TRI, you know, no CFATs or whatever else I'm having to evaluate for, or tier 2, no TRI. So it doesn't have TRI chemicals, so at least that I've got an initial glance. But kind of like what Lauren said is I guess how I'd look at it. Let's say that you have 100 catalysts that you're using, and 75 of them are all basically pretty much the same general makeup, different, as you said, tweaks here and there, but they're all the same, and they carry the same hazards. I'd group them all together. If the other 25, let's say that 15 of them all say not subject to OSHA 1910, 1200, they're deemed non-hazardous, break them out in a category, and I would not report them because they're in that category. The other ones, if they have got, you know, again, like as you said, what if they had aluminum oxide, but then, oh, well, this one has a little bit of cobalt, and this one has a little bit of beryllium. The fact of the matter is, it's still a catalyst. If they still have similar hazard characteristics, I would group them all into the main big group and go. I mean, the difference for the tier 2 versus tier I is, you know, most of the time your aluminum oxide is not fibrous, so you're not reporting that on tier I anyway, but it is just making sure is if the general hazard characteristics are there, you either add them all together and then, you know, to make it simpler on yourself, unless something specifically just says it's not even subject and you don't even include those volumes together. I mean, again, that's, as she said, document why, because somebody may ask, well, wait a minute, this has got a hazard characteristic, because you're now looking at the catalyst in whole. If it has no EHS, then you're okay. It's no different, you know, you're breaking out to see is the mixture as you buy it hazardous. Mm-hmm. So that's really the most important thing that they're looking for a tier 2 is group it all together. Whether it's inks and it's blue, green, yellow, whatever, they're all combustible. They all have something, or they're an irritant. They've all got something in them. They may vary in concentrations on the different ingredients, but they're just different colors. They're still inks. They're still got the same general. We just grouped them all together and move on down the road.
The other part of that is I can forward you, I know TCEQ has a specific Q&A on grouping, which I don't know if you've seen it.
No.
So I can forward you,
Nice.
I'd read that probably since you're in Texas.
Yeah.
And that might give you a better feel for maybe like their intent when they're looking at it.
Yep, that's a good idea. It's a very good idea.
Alrighty. Okay, so lastly, we've got some items that are commonly overlooked. So just to touch on some ones that you'll want to be sure and double check. Fuel, so diesel tanks, propane tanks, and one thing I'd mention for this bullet is that when we do audits or corporate EHS audits, one of the things that we'll compare against are like your SPCC plan. So taking that plan, which lists all of your oil tanks and fuel tanks, and comparing that to make sure you've incorporated all of them on your tier 2. So doing double checks like that. Containerized gases, so your big tanks of oxygen, but also your big tanks of propane and your cylinders of propane that might be on your forklifts or bottles located throughout the facility. Once you've exceeded that 10,000 pound threshold, making sure that we've incorporated all of our different container types and locations on the physical tier 2 form. Lead acid batteries, ammonia used as a refrigerant, chiller units, filtration media, hydraulic oils, dielectric oils. I've seen people kind of go back and forth on transformers, but particularly if you're the owner of those really big transformer systems, making sure you've got dielectric oil, large tanks, but also your day tanks, totes and drums, pesticides, and ice melt. So as we've seen, EPA can kind of choose really random things to focus in on, and ice melt is one of those commonly overlooked items. Yeah.
What is ice?
Yeah, so it would be more for like your northeastern facilities, but sometimes in their warehouses they'll have whole sections of like boxes and containers of ice melt for when it.
There's a lot of times there's the granular,
That's the
granular
salt.
stuff. Yeah, but
Yep.
but then you do have some liquids where they can, you know, spray them on stuff for prevention. You know, a lot like the aircraft stuff where they will put that on, not forklifts, but like cranes, things that are on site when they're using, and those have glycol ethers in them, which of course then you got to look at for TRI purposes as well. So.
And the other item I'd mention here is just keeping an eye out for chemical and product specific guidance from your state. So like for oil and gas facilities, sometimes people may not know what to do with the brine water, but their state may have issued specifically saying, we don't want to know about your brine, or we do want to know about your brine. If you don't include it, we're going to look for that.
Right.
So there's always those little things. All right, so we made it through 302, 304, 311, 312. Any questions on?
13 for me.
Now the most fun. The most fun.
Any questions on tier 2? Okay.
Alrighty. Well, I will, if you want to give you a break so you can sit down. I will get started on TRI, which is basically the rest of the day. More because what we want to also focus on, besides the generic reporting, which people get used to doing, but what we are starting to find out, that Lauren and I are finding out, is we're amazed at the people who have said, I've done this for years. And I'm like, you're amazing how much you've forgotten, and the scrutiny has really changed. And I guess as engineers working in our lovely industrial world and with EPA, it's becoming very clear. EPA's got a lot of money hanging on the table in enforcement fines that they can be making, because as Lauren and I continue to do audits, and we are now doing a lot of focused EPCRA audits, and I don't even call them audits now because it gets people all panicked. We call them assessments, and we call them assessments, and now I'll tell you why we call them assessments. One, when they got it, it always freaks out the lawyers and stuff. But two, I've probably done a couple hundred EPCRA audits, really more TRI audits. I've probably done over 40 voluntary disclosures. 99% of them are EPCRA. 0 fines, knock on wood, in a lot of different industries, but it is one of those things that it is. I love the people who tell me, oh, I've done this for years, everything's fine. And I'm like, let me come to your site. I will guarantee you I will find something. And it actually becomes fun. You just got to have fun with it.
Now, if you're doing an assessment, do you still get to do audit privilege?
Yes, and I will tell you how that does. We will talk about that, because that's actually, I've gotten really good with a lot of my lawyer buddies on how we pull this one off. But EPA doesn't know all this, but it's one of those. I've done some retroactive audit privilege on some things where it's just like, you have to understand how the system works and how you do this, because it is amazing. Just because I go to a site for a couple of days, I may know darn good and well that there's an issue. It will not happen. It'll be more researched and more found out before I'm ready to tell anybody. And I also, sometimes have actually been in the middle of an audit, and then an assessment, where a lot of times why we call it an assessment is because we'll also reward you on looking at best management practices, looking at have an intermix of, instead of do an audit and here's your report, we'll talk about it. We'll finish at the end of the day. It's like, well, tell me how you do this. Well, what do you think? Well, maybe there's a better idea to share. Here's a spreadsheet that we do, and here's what we're working on. And so it is more of a sharing of information, and maybe some better ways to document or to do your reporting. And unless we find something, we at least put some people on alert of what we find. My preference, and we'll get into that when we talk about the enforcement, and we covered this a little bit more on the TRI Advanced, is there is a way to work it so that you can take advantage of the audit privilege. Texas is an interesting one. Texas has its own, it's got the Audit Privilege Act. What is interesting though is you have to file the audit, you have to file the notification that you're going to do an audit beforehand. But what I have to continue to remind people, TRI is a federal program. You're not subject to the state on that. So you have to follow the voluntary audit policy that EPA has in place. And so we'll talk about that audit privilege. My thing is if you suspect that, let's say that you've taken over for a facility, you haven't been there, and you think, we might have some issues, we're not really sure. My first thing we'll say is, let's go through outside counsel. He will not do much, or she will not do much, but I want the protection. A lot of people are like, well, let's go to in-house counsel. I'm like, that's the client. I don't want to tell your in-house counsel, because then I've notified you. That starts the time clock. for voluntary audit policy. So we'll go into some of this discussion, but there's really good ways to go about and handle an assessment, and I think we've honed it to a T. So we'll have some more discussion on this. Big picture overview. This is one of the things that I laugh about is you talk about TRI, you talk about EPCRA 313, you talk about EPCRA, you talk about toxic release inventory reporting, you talk about SARA. I was like, what the hell are all these things going? And I've actually had this discussion with Sage when we first came on board. I'm like, I know it's synonymous, but I'm like, no, let's go how we really are approaching this with EPCRA. TRI, the toxic release inventory, this is the annual report of, okay, you've stored all this stuff from your tier 2. Now what do you do with it? Okay? It is what is used. You could store stuff in perpetuity and never run it through your system. You'd never be subject to TRI. You would not be filing a TRI report. Inventory and storage, and this is, as Lauren said, this is what happens when it starts going through your system and you start using it. Throughput. Congress passed this with the Superfund amendments, okay? They passed it in 1986. That's where it came in. They had an initial list, and this is under Superfund. And then the statute for EPCRA came up within Superfund. So it's a weird thing. It is a statute within a statute. And then EPCRA has the implementing regulations to put into TRI. One of the things, again, is that it mandates this reporting every year. And again, the whole thing was Bhopal. That's what started this whole mess. And what they want to know is if you're handling this big of an amount of toxic substances and you're running it through your system, we want the public to know about it. And this provides more, and we'll go into that later, this provides more underlying information for almost all the regulations that govern us on the environmental side. Why it's got so many names is it's actually in the statute under Title III, which is under the SARA. You have Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act. So you have your EPCRA, SARA. They call it 313 because it's Section 313, just like Section 311, 312. So it's called a lot of stuff. A lot of people go, well, we've got TRI reporting. I don't know why, but I hate that. I hate that TRI reporting. I'm like, that makes it sound like, well, if we can get it kind of done half-assed, we'll get it. You know, I'm trying to do it. And I'm like, I don't like TRI reporting, so it's TRI. And the purpose, I mean, EPA's website really says that empower the citizens with this information so that they can use it to make sure that the government is accountable for what is happening. Unlike TSCA, where you're actually creating chemicals or they want to know how it's being used, what's being exported, TRI focuses on you're using all this stuff, where does it really go? Because 100% of it doesn't go into your final product. Most of the time, 100% doesn't go in your final product. 7 industry sectors have been added to the TRI since 1987. They also doubled the chemicals to about 650. You obviously remember you've got individual chemicals, you also have chemical categories, but they added the PBT chemicals in 1999, and that's your lead, your mercury, the PACs, all sorts of other, and they just added a new one. Last year they added nitrotoluene, trinitrotoluene, and then they added another one for 2014, which will be due for 2016 report or for 2015 reporting. You know, they're adding chemicals. You know, they will sometimes delist some chemicals, but they do add new ones. Dioxin got put in 2008. How many? Let's talk about this. How many chemicals, Ron, for some of your facilities on average do you report?
I don't know.
You don't have any idea? Okay. Okay.
I don't know.
How about you?
The last time I haven't done TRI for this facility yet.
Oh, goody.
It's insane.
God, can we come down and help? That'd be fun. We actually like doing this. That's kind of scary. Again, it's sick minds. Most people are like, you like doing TRI? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's fun.
I mean, I did TRI for terminals.
Uh-huh.
Just fuels terminals.
Right.
And asphalt.
Right. Yeah, 3 or 4. Yeah, that sounds right. I've done some fuel terminals and stuff. So yeah, you're typically, I would think for some of your facilities, you may be in the 10 or 12 range, maybe more.
The one I did recently was like,
Yeah, that's good. You get some of these refineries, Lauren, and I get in and you're like 25, 28. I'm like, oh my God. I think we had 12 when I was at the auto plant. We had 12. We had one purge thinner that was used. I mean, it was the best stuff. It cleaned everything. And it had 12, I mean, we use 300,000 gallons of this stuff a year, but when you're making 50 cars an hour, but this was awesome stuff. It had methanol, MIBK, MEK when it was a HAP and a TRI chemical, ethyl benzene, methanol. I mean, it had so much. It had like 10 TRI chemicals in it, and I'm like, this was great. I mean, it would have, it took care of your, nail polish remover. I mean, it cleaned beautifully. I mean, and they'd pick this stuff up and just literally slop this stuff on the walls of the paint booth to clean. I mean, it was awesome stuff. You get a rag and a little bucket, take it home. It could clean everything at home. It's great. Take off the paint on everything that you had. So it was good stuff. Purge thinner. I'm not going to talk about TRI regulations. Part of the TRI regulations does require supplier notification. And what these requirements are, and this is again where this follows into, tying to EPCRA, your suppliers owe you the MSDS every year. They're starting to hit on this pretty hard for Tier 2 purposes, but also for TRI purposes. And what the notification is that they require suppliers to any covered facility, such as yourselves, that they have to list the TRI chemicals that are present in their products when they're sending them to you. Now, also remember, there are de minimis weight percents according to OSHA, the 1% carcinogen or non-carcinogen, 0.1% carcinogen that they can follow. So if anything's below that, they don't have to put that on the supplier notification on that MSDS. Of course, they didn't really pull that thing together for PBT chemicals, so we'll talk about that as well. Because a lot of your PBT chemicals are contained in very small de minimis amounts. There's no de minimis, so you have to report them anyway. But you have to identify, this is in section 15, like Lauren had noted on an SDS, MSDS. Section 15 typically will tell you what chemicals are present. They still seem to always put aluminum oxide, even though it's non-fibrous. It happens all the time, and quite frankly, Lauren and I've done work for a big catalyst manufacturer who supplies most of catalyst to all the refineries and stuff, and I called him up and I said, I'm asking you, I already know the question, I did your damn TRI, this isn't fibrous, and he's like, yeah, so I documented it, because it was a couple years old since I'd done some work for him, so I documented it, and then I sent it out to all of the stage people who are doing TRI work. If you're getting your catalyst from Criterion, it doesn't contain fibrous aluminum oxide.
Some of them will list it specifically.
Exactly, but very few. And they're like, how do you know? And I'm like, okay. So then I have the email that I saved that has the EPA definition of fibrous aluminum oxide, and that's typically used in the electroplating industry, and it's not, aluminum oxide is a pigment and a natural occurring mineral, so it's like, move on. But suppliers are supposed to provide you updates when they have significant changes. And of course, that's something they ought to be doing anyway. And besides looking at it for TRI, that could be the measure of when they start getting rid of some of the consumer product MACT that was coming out. They were actually starting to get rid of lead in a lot of consumer products where it's being used. Well, you should make sure and double check that, because then you may not be subject to reporting, since a lot of things, unless you're using stainless steel, brass, and bronze alloys, lead's got a 100-pound threshold. So it doesn't take much to add up to that number. But as they started revamping and redoing a lot of consumer products and a lot of products that you use, they're literally taking the lead out, and they're getting rid of other TRI chemicals present, and that's where you should keep up. It's also good because it affects your air permit. It affects a lot of things, and you want to make sure that you're covered. For 313, obviously for 4MR reporting, that's the other thing it gets called. The major piece is applicability. Are you even subject to it? You have very defined very defined, very specific definitions that you need to follow to make sure that you are accurately pulling together the information, comparing to the thresholds. Then you have a whole bunch of other information required regarding your releases as far as where did it go to all media. And it has to be supplied by January 1st. July 1st, January 1st, sorry, July 1st. Thank God it's not done by January 1st. So did every other company, right? Yeah, okay. TRI reports are submitted to EPA. You use it via the CDX. Now what they're doing, they have a number of states, and once you submit it to EPA, it automatically goes to certain states that are in their database, that it automatically goes. In other cases, sometimes you have to send a zip file or a flash drive over to the state or the designated tribal office. There's two parts to Form R. First, you have to do the applicability determination. We have lots of fun people who like to look at the air emission releases that you have from your recent EI that was filed always before July 1st, and they look at that and say, okay, we've got a report. I'm like, no, you have to do your applicability determination. It is not based on your emission inventory. It is based on your applicability determination. Be very careful. Starting in the middle could lead to problems, and it has led to problems. You have 3 steps. You have to be a covered facility, so your NAICS code has to match up to the required codes that they have listed. Typically, if you're in industry such as what we have, you're subject. 10 full-time equivalent employees, including contractors, including part-time employees. Once you have met those, then you start taking a look at the actual threshold and see if you have utilized enough chemical to trigger any of the 3 reporting thresholds. Only until you have completed that applicability determination do you get into the reporting. If you've exceeded a threshold for any chemical in any manner, then you get into the release reporting, and then you provide the information that is on the Form R report. The employee hours are based on total hours worked, at or above 20,000 hours per year. You really need to document, talk to your HR people, because you have changes back and forth, year to year, maybe on people or contractors, and make sure you have the information of what they have for Department of Labor, and stick a copy of that documentation for the reporting year in your backup documentation file. Okay? One of our other training people here, Bruce Dumdye, Bruce and I have known each other for 25, 30 years between different companies that we've been with, and he's actually been at an audit where EPA asked for the paperwork determination that verified, and it's like, you have 300 people, why would you have that discussion? But they wanted it in your backup documentation. So something good. Covered NAICS code, and then you get into your manufactured, process, and otherwise used for all of the chemicals that you're using, whether they are pure substances or they are mixtures or fuels. You have to meet all 3. I love when we get phone calls from people, it's like, we're a covered code, we use a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm like, how many employees are on site? 3? Done, you're out. And then they're very happy, very happy. NAICS codes that they were first adopted for TRI reporting in 2008. They replaced the SIC code, Standard Industrial Classification Code. There is really not a correlation. Every year, EPA does publish on the website. They will give you the latest and greatest NAICS code. Double check that yours is correct. If you have changes at your facility, I have a facility that was a refinery and a bulk fuel storage terminal. They idled the refinery. It is non-operational. They're just bulk fuel storage. I said, you really ought to change your NAICS code. You're covered still, but you ought to change it. And they're like, no, we're okay, no big deal. Well, last year when we put together, EPA Region 6 sent them a note and said, why are you not reporting H2S when you're a refinery? And he's like, we're not a refinery anymore. We have sulfur in our crude and in our fuels, but We don't heat up, we don't do it, we don't have H2S. He goes, then why is your NAICS code not changed? I felt really vindicated because I have in my email both years, we really need to change your NAICS code. How do you want to do this? Nothing happened. And of course, those codes get changed in admin because those are filed with the Department of Labor. It's not an environmental requirement specifically. You can refer to the list of NAICS facilities. They do print the codes every year in the TRI instructions, and you can get that off there. But again, they do have an Excel format one, so you can check that as well. The industrial sectors that are subject to TRI, I mean, most of them are here. When we talk about a manufacturing sector, such as what you have in the chemical, the petroleum, any, bulk fuel terminals, you are looking at refineries, foundries. You're a manufacturing site. You're going to be using these materials in some way, shape, or form. They do have categories that include metal mining, coal mining, as long as you are not underground. It doesn't cover the underground part. It's basically when you bring the ore up and you do beneficiation of processing those ores. Electrical utilities, TSD sites, solvent recovery services, again, petroleum bulk terminals, and chemical distributors. They are now subject. They are, they can always add more sectors. At this point in time, they don't, but they are starting to consider it again of adding some additional industrial categories and sectors, and that's something that can happen. They'll go through the formal rulemaking process. Typically, if they put out a regulation in, let's say, 2015, it will be that you have to start accounting for it in 2016 calendar year and be reported in 2017. The thresholds that we are looking at for reporting, you've got 3. Otherwise use, 10,000 pounds, manufacture and process, or 25,000. This is a calendar year threshold. Your thresholds are lower for the PBT chemicals such as your mercury, your lead, your PAX, your dioxins. Mercury is 10 pounds, lead is 100 pounds. Lead is 100 pounds. Again, that was lowered in, I think, 2001, 2002. But lead is the only one that has 2 thresholds. You still can use a 25,000 pound threshold for processing and manufacture as long as you are dealing with alloys of stainless steel, brass, or bronze. Zinc, carbon steel, anything else that contains lead as impurity or is part of that process, you are hitting against the 100 pound threshold. Mixtures and compounds do require a special care because you need to be very careful how you calculate it out. When you calculate a threshold for a metal alloy, you are looking at if there's a metal compound, if there is copper oxide contained in a mixture, you count the total amount of copper oxide in the mixture. If you then trigger that 25,000 pound threshold for processing, when you do the release calculations, you're only calculating the parent metal of copper that is contained in the copper oxide. When we talk about the threshold categories, these definitions are really crucial because what people aren't giving them, and one of the things is Lauren and I do more auditing. I really think since 1986, people was like, oh, TRI. You have to do your mission inventory. You get your tier 2. Oh, TRI. You slap together what you send out on the manifest. You put your air emissions down, put the same number down, and everything's fine, no big deal. It's much more complex, and what they're starting to find, what EPA is finding out when they do their data quality checks, that's what they call it, data quality checks, okay? Not an audit, data quality check, is there is a lot of discussion as far as are you properly assessing the chemical that you're using or the intermediate or the fuel to the proper threshold, okay? When you manufacture, you're producing, you're preparing, you're actually making a new product. Whether it is coincidental manufacturing or you're compounding 2 materials to make a new mixture. Importing from overseas into the US, sometimes even through a broker, is considered manufacturing. In most cases, you're also going to be taking that same material that you import and you're going to be processing it, so you're going to end up triggering both thresholds, okay?
So what is the coincidental manufacturing?
Coincidental, well, we got the next slide, we'll talk about that. That is when you are burning fuel and you form new TRI chemicals, where you're combining, basically combusting a fuel. The fuel itself may contain TRI chemicals, but when you burn it, due to the heat and the combustion, you're actually forming new ones.
That's considered manufacturing.
That is considered manufacturing because now you have changed the valence. You change valence on something, you have manufactured it, okay? Processing. This is where you're buying chemicals, you're buying products, you're taking catalysts, you're mixing them together, and you are making, fuels. This is your additives that when you're making fuels and mixing. This is combining toluene and xylene and pigment to make your paints or your inks. That is processing. You're mixing them together. Not always a chemical reaction is occurring. It can just be mechanical mixing. Sometimes chemical manufacturing can occur and you may have a reaction where that particular component stays like it is. It's just that you have combined and made a new commercial sellable product. If it's going out the door to be sold and you're going to make profit off of it, that is processing, okay? Otherwise use pretty much is a catch-all for if it doesn't make it in manufacturing and it doesn't make it into processing, it's otherwise use. This is for the chemicals that you use where you may be using the fuel in the boiler. That's not being sold, you're just using a boiler because you need to make steam. And you use a lot of steam. These are for the cleaners when you're talking about cleaning a lot of your equipment, bringing in all sorts of different cleaning materials, lubricants, oils, cutting fluids. Any of those that help and aid in your processing so you can make whatever you're making to ship out the door, that's where this comes into play. That is otherwise use. It is not being incorporated into the final product that is being shipped out. Yeah. But aids in the manufacturer, aids in you to be able to do what you're doing. Painting, process equipment is an otherwise use of paint. If you make paint or you paint chairs and then you ship the chairs out to, furniture stores, now you've processed the pigment in the paint. Additional examples: manufacturer, we're producing, we're preparing, importing, chlorine dioxide used on site for water treatment, nitric acid, acids being put into wastewater treatment for pH control. Any byproducts that are created from a chemical reaction. Again, that's where you have to be careful. This is where we start talking about that manufacturing, where you're not trying to create it, but it just happens because that's part of it. Now, if you have created a byproduct and you may be selling that, then you want to make sure you're manufacturing and then you're also processing it. Again, you may have a particular chemical that you're using where it actually goes through all three categories. You only have to trigger one to trip reporting.
Is that waste? How does it?
Not necessarily. You may be forming a byproduct and you can use that as a sellable product, but not necessarily waste. If you ship it out as waste, again, this is where we want to start talking about where is it going and knowing the process. This is where the process flow diagrams and really knowing what happens at your facility of what's being created and how is it going out. If you make a byproduct, it could be going out, you're either creating a waste or you're making a byproduct that can go for further sale.
Okay.
Okay?
The reason I'm asking is we have a situation, I'm not sure if it triggers for this particular industry, but depending on if we can sell the product, it's the co-product, and so we sell the gypsum waste. Or if we can't find a buyer, we have to ship it out as waste.
Right.
And that's a big one for us. It changes a lot depending on
Yeah.
the year, but there's probably others that we can find a buyer for waste that's
Sure.
the product.
Sure.
So we have to report it.
Yeah, that's a good one. We've
Because I know that we're doing a lot of emphasis on pollution prevention and trying to find ways to take what is currently a waste
right
and redirect it.
and be right.
So if that occurs, then that would need to be looked at as far as, is that now
Correct, because if you have it, if you have something you can find somebody where you can direct it to it where it is directly reused by them, then it's never going to show up because it's a product. It is not a release. It is going for direct reuse. If you're sending scrap steel that you have shaved off and lathed and everything, and you got scrap steel and it's got cutting fluids mixed in it and it's a bunch of chips and stuff, even if you 100% are sending it off to a broker for recycle, he's got to clean it up before he can, and then segregate the metals. He's got to clean it up and do some work on it. That is still a waste. You know, that is a waste. It cannot be directly reused. They have to clean it up, then they have to segregate the different metal alloys, and then they have to melt it. There has to be work done to it. Direct reuse means that you take the scrap that comes off and it's immediately being, you know, I had an aluminum manufacturer that they would cut off, they would take big, thick coils of steel, run it through a press and make it really tiny, like aluminum foil or something very, very thin. And they'd shear off the edge so it had a nice straight edge to it. The sheared off pieces were bundled up, packaged, and sent back to their casting plant for melt. That is direct reuse. So they triggered reporting and had 0 releases.
Another instance that might affect you is what we were talking about with catalysts. So for certain catalysts, you might ship them off as hazardous waste with manifests, but others may go for recycle. So just making sure that, you know, you're getting your shipping papers in the manifests.
Right. You had a question, Ron, we were talking about coincidental manufacturing. And what this refers to, the definition is that it's produced coincidentally as a result of your manufacturing process, otherwise using another chemical, and because of the fact that it remains back in the mixture and you've created something else. Okay? Here's some examples. When you put an ammonium salt in water, you are forming aqueous ammonia. Aqueous ammonia is reportable. Okay? Ammonium bicarbonate, ammonium sulfate. Again, you can create those when you are using the chemicals and you are putting a salt and you're putting in a liquid. You can create the salts. You are now making a new chemical. Nitrates, this is a big one. There was a very big initiative by EPA when they were finding out that a lot of people were submitting Form R reports for nitric acid. Used a lot for pH control in wastewater, okay? Same companies were not reporting nitrates. Nitrates are formed, coincidentally, when you put nitric acid into water. They weren't reporting for nitrates, and nitrates are a TRI chemical. You have a reportable TRI chemical that you're already using, and it would be in otherwise use because it is not incorporated, it's used in wastewater, it's not incorporated in your product. But by putting it into the water for pH control, you formed another TRI chemical, nitrates. You have to do a calculation for it. And so they went on, they made a lot of money one year. I actually was really busy that year because what they did is they gave you the regulatory letter that says you're in violation, you should have formed nitrates, so you got a TRI penalty, and then they put on top of that as part of the injunctive relief is that you had to have an independent third party do a full TRI audit of your facility. It was a busy time. It was a busy time. So this is one that they have seen, that if you do report for nitric acid, make sure that you either are or are not supposed to be reporting for nitrates. And again, this is all based on the process. What are your processes? What's happening? And that's what we are starting to see. It is much more complex. They want to know, what are you doing with all the chemicals that come into your plant? You know, in the refinery industry, chemical industry, you have a lot of stuff that once you add in chemicals, you have some intermediates, and then it forms something else through the process. You may have manufactured something in process. It may not be the same chemical though when it gets out, but you manufactured it in here. You have to do a threshold calculation for it. So you have to know your process. You have to talk to your process engineers. Okay, so that's, again, it is much more complex, and I think that's one of the reasons why we like it. Is it's like a puzzle, and it's really fascinating because you've got to look at all through the whole plant, where is something happening? What is going on? Am I concentrating a chemical that was previously de minimis, and I'm concentrating it now where it's exceeded de minimis, and now I got to start counting it? You know, these are, it's a lot more complicated and more complex, and EPA is starting to find that. And why they're doing a lot more auditing is because they're finding out that age-old companies, i.e. refining industry, foundries, manufacturing, have been kind of just going by and doing the same old thing. They haven't changed their spreadsheets for 20 years. And trust me, they are messed up. And the people who have taken over after lots of turnover and lean manufacturing and personnel changes, they're finding out that the people who are in charge of doing the TRI really don't know the regulation. So again, that's where all this continues to push to. Combustion of fuels is a big one. Numerous refineries that we have done work for miss combustion of fuels because you have so many things you're reporting on anyway. You have a lot of big air emissions anyway, but EPA wants everything evaluated. And what they're missing is the combustion of fuels in their trucks and their man lifts and their forklifts and all the other stuff. Has to be done. Rare that you're going to ever trigger a threshold with combustion of fuels. However, you do need to show it.
I'd say, especially with combustion of fuels, particularly the incorporation of dioxin, which may not be something that you're incorporating with like AP42, but an initiative that they've done is to make sure that facilities are incorporating dioxin combustion calculations.
And that's one of the things when we started first going through we weren't even messing with, but again, they keep honing it. So we just got to keep adding that component. Processing. Again, this is taking you're taking a toxic chemical contained in a mixture, in an intermediate, in an additive, and you are putting it, you're basically preparing it so that it's going to go out in that mixture as an ingredient for distribution, either in the same or maybe even a modified form. So you could be forming something on the manufacturing side and then you're incorporating it into another product and mixture and you're shipping that out the door. This can be dyes, repackaging of listed materials. If you have a tanker come in of ammonia and you are now putting it in 5-gallon bottles, that's repackaging, okay? It's not coming in and going out the same manner. That is repackaging, so you have to be careful there. Metal fabrication. When you bring in alloys, you are grinding and abrading or carving or cutting, anything like that, you are processing that alloy. An alloy is just a solid mixture, treated the exact same way. Otherwise use. This is chemicals, TRI chemicals or mixtures that you are using that are not incorporated into product for distribution or commerce. This is refrigerants, this is paints, solvents, anything that is used to basically take care of your facility equipment. We will talk about exemptions because there is a very fine line. But if you're taking care of process equipment and you're using paint, solvents, your water treatment chemicals, any type of cleaners, anything process related, that's not incorporated into your product, that is what's going to be considered an otherwise use. De minimis exemptions. This follows the OSHA definition. It is 1% for a non-carcinogen, 0.1% for an OSHA carcinogen. This is exactly the same as the OSHA definition. It's exactly the same that it requires for Tier 2 reporting and for MSDS reporting. It always holds there. PBTs, those are different. Mercury compounds, lead compounds, PACs, dioxins, all have their own individual thresholds. So you have to abide by that. So we have an example here. Obviously, you've got a material that contains 1.1% toluene and 0.6% manganese. So are we exempt from TRI using this product? Let's assume that it is 100,000 pounds that we use. Would this be part of your determination, and how would you go about doing it? Now again, this also takes to assume that, oh yeah, what's the de minimis level for a lot of these chemicals, but no. Neither one is carcinogenic.
It's supposed to be less than 1%.
Right. Toluene, both of them have a de minimis of 1%. So for this particular mixture, the toluene would be counted. The 1.1% multiplied by the total pounds of that material would be used. The manganese it's under 1%. So you would ignore it. Now, what you would make sure to do is you would ignore it, but you would say exempt, de minimis exempt. Again, these are the little pieces that EPA is looking for. They want all of your products evaluated. If they contain a TRI chemical, you either knock it off the list due to some type of an exemption, or you count it in your threshold determinations after you've put it into the correct category. There are activity-related exemptions. Okay, we have different types of exemptions. The activity-related exemptions are routine janitorial. This is very similar, kind of when we were talking about Tier 2, consumer products. Routine janitorial, where you're just mopping up floors, doing any painting of the outside structure or posts or anything outside, as long as it is not process-related equipment. If you paint your railings inside, great. If you paint grating around your process equipment, that isn't exempt. If you paint tanks, if you paint compressors, if you paint boilers, anything that you are involved in where you are actually working on process fluids, those are not exempt activities. Okay? So when you look at maintenance activities, you have to ask the next question. Is it facility maintenance activities or is it process maintenance activities? If they're welding on process equipment to keep it fixed, it's process related, okay? Personal use, you're white out. We don't bother with that stuff. Any of your toners, any of the other stuff for inks in your admin offices. Structural components of the facility. You have your I-beams, you basically have your facility. If you're painting that, you're painting, I know we've talked about this, but like forklift striping. We consider that, I think we consider that facility maintenance. We exempt that out. But again, what we try to make sure, materials used with facility motor vehicles. So your forklifts, your, the fluents, the lubricants, the oils, the stuff used with facility vehicles. Typically, those that are activity, there's a mobile source activity exemption. And we'll talk about what you do have to include for those. Any materials, any TRI chemicals that come in on your incoming process water that you don't have control over, those are exempt. If you add stuff while it's here in your plant and then you ship it out, that's a whole different story. But what's coming in, again, make sure and document it, especially if there's elevated levels of anything, whether it's copper or manganese or anything that could potentially be coming in. Make sure that you have it accounted for, that you're not claiming basically accountability for it. The other exemptions, we have an article exemption. Here's where the famous article exemption comes from. And then you have facility exemptions that deal with laboratories, R&D, sampling and analysis, QA/QC. The information, again, once you do a threshold determination, you have exceeded a threshold, then you're actually filling out a Form R specifically for that chemical. Okay? If you trigger, let's say that let's talk about our famous toluene. Say you bring toluene in, it's being shipped to you and you're making paint and ink. You are processing the toluene. But hey, it's a good cleaner. So we're also taking some buckets here and we'll clean off the paint booth and we'll clean off the metal and we'll just kind of wipe everything down because it makes it nice and shiny. You're otherwise using it. If you trigger just for one, you're reporting. You trigger for both, you're reporting. Once you trigger reporting, I don't care what you use for manufacturer, process, or otherwise use, it's all getting accounted for on that Form R report. You're going to check off that you have all the thresholds that you triggered. once you have exceeded a threshold for that particular chemical, whichever one it may be, okay? You could use 20,000 pounds of toluene for processing, and you could use 12,000 pounds of toluene for otherwise use. You exceeded otherwise use. You didn't for processing. However, your Form R is going to account for the fact that you had 32,000 pounds of toluene used at your facility. What happened? What was released? You look at on-site chemical use. You look at where the releases go from that, like as such to air, fugitive or point. You have off-site transfers. Are you sending off to somebody else? Do you have waste treatment, recycling? And then, of course, you have the designated felon certification. That's never us. It's always higher, you know. The releases that you're going to be looking to incorporate in the Form R deal with air, water, and waste. You will take care of releases, but then you also have to put on there, where do your offsite transfers go? You know, is it going to a POTW? Is it going to a TSD? Where is this going? Underground injection well? And what we'll talk about here is, what are you going to report? How are you going to calculate it? And then anything specific to the Form R. Typical TRI facility. I mean, this, you know, some of this you may have, some of this you may not have, but the types of releases you're going to be reporting are, once your feedstock comes in, your product is going out. There's your mass balance on that particular place. What they're looking at is the overall mass balance. What is going to air as point source or fugitive? What transfers off-site for recycling? Do you have any treatment that you're doing on-site? What's going off for disposal? Did you have any chemicals going on? Again, this is for the specific chemical that you have triggered the threshold for. Where is it going? So many of these may not apply, but this is what you have to do for every chemical that you have triggered reporting for. I'm glossing over this because you have a Form R. You're not going to be filling out paper forms. No to paper forms. They don't take paper forms. You know, they're trying to get away from that as much as possible. You have a Form R Schedule 1 for dioxins, and that is only used if you're reporting for the dioxin and the dioxin compounds. My opinion, and I know it says our opinion, my opinion is Form A is a waste of time to use. Form A, if you've had to deal with them or not, is, you know, you use a whole lot of pounds of a material, but your aggregate releases, air, water, waste, everything added together is less than 500 pounds. It's good for some manufacturing operations. Sometimes it's good. They've talked about getting rid of it, but most of the fact is you may have a whole lot coming in, but you don't have a whole lot going out. So that is part of it to make it simple, but you have to be very careful. If you file a Form A and you should have been filing a Form R, it is considered a violation as if you had never filed the report. So again, Form R reports have a whole lot more information on them. You better have really good documentation on filing a Form A.
We file a Form A besides that work on.
Okay.
Yeah.
As long as you have good documentation, it's all good. But there's some people who have filed Form A's and they have no backup documentation on how they got to it, and they get busted big time. I
mean, it's just all your release documentation, right?
Yeah, but a lot of times what people thought is that it's 500 for air, it's 500 for water, it's 500 for, it's aggregate, 500 total pounds of everything added together.
It's also how much you use of it too. Isn't there like 1 million?
Yeah, it's 1 million pounds. So it's 1 million pounds or more. So
I've seen some people pay close attention to the release portion because they're positive about that, because maybe it's some really low number.
Right.
But the amount coming in is in excess.
And then I just have it done.
And they just hadn't even thought to, you know, hadn't
Right.
looked at the rule in a while and hadn't even thought, as their site got bigger and more was
Right.
coming in, you know, there's two parts to it. So how much you use and how much you release.
some of the changes for Form R, and I just looked at the EPA website about a week or so ago, and there's actually some additional changes that they're adding on the Form R. I mean, they're really trying to populate, I think for water, they're pre-populating a lot of the calculations for water releases so that you don't have to do it. And I guess is there some software program or whatever that does some of those calculations, Lauren? I thought that I had just read that. Really important, this whole thing about the certifying official, you have to have an electronic, signature from them, and that has to be approved. They're trying to make it so that it's not, what we have found is when we are doing assessments for people, or there's been a change in a plant manager, even if it's now and they're a TRI submitter, go ahead and get it done. Don't do it, 2 weeks before, TRIs are due, because then there's this glut of people trying to hurry up and get it approved. I keep forgetting that I have
they
this
have to
attached.
just sign the submission before it can enter it into it?
So basically, it can work two ways depending on. So you can become a certifying official online, and so then no paper is required at all. But I think since I'm not a certifying official, I've never actually physically done it. But we've had certifying officials who haven't shown up in the system,
Right.
either because their facility isn't I don't know the exact requirement. You have to be on some sort of something or other background. So then if you don't get to electronically sign, then you have to submit paper forms, which take a while.
Right.
So, but I mean, I'm just, maybe it's just the way that I'm reading this, because I needed more coffee this morning or something. So generally what we do is we have a designated certifying official. They're registered, make sure that they can electronically sign it
Right.
in advance.
Right.
They don't actually sign.
They don't actually sign something. They basically they get an email once it's been submitted. They will get an email that says that now you need to basically log in so that you can sign in and quote unquote electronically submit and accept the Form R.
Okay.
Yeah. You're not physically signing something. I mean, to register to be a certifying official, they used to have that you had to fill out the paper form. And then they're trying, I think it was last year that they started trying to get.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were talking about a CSA to become a certifying official.
Right.
Okay.
Very different. Yeah.
So, but on this one, I mean, it still works the same as it did last time.
Yeah.
You can put all the information in the database, you just can't actually.
Correct. You can put, you can fill out your Form R online without having the certifying official able to sign it. But once you submit that, then there has to be a certifying official, because the email is supposed to go to him or her so that they can log in and quote unquote sign it. And if they're not there, then it is uncertified.
Did it used to be different? I mean, this is only, I didn't see a TRI report to 2000.
It used to be, and that's what I was trying to remember, is last year changed Last year changed so that they have a simpler format to get it approved and without having to USPS mail something to it. You used to have to download, physically sign it, send it back in. Now it's allowing another manner besides that you can actually sign and become a certifying official, and it's supposed to be faster that you can.
Yeah, so your role as the preparer has been the same for a really long time.
Right.
It's really just the certification.
Right.
Well, we had a new environmental manager who was our certifying official, and I think he did it all online. I don't think.
Yeah.
But like I said, that's.
It started last year where they were allowing you to go online and do it all via email, because the prior year there was stuff where we had some people that lost out, and we were literally scrambling to get them in, because it would take sometimes up to 10 days to get them approved to be able to serve and be certified. Facilities you required, again, the NAICS codes, they have a 2012, they publish it probably every 2 years or something, but there's the 2012 NAICS codes, they do have them updated, they put that in the instruction. forms that you can, download, because they don't even send out the books anymore, I don't think. But the thing is you can get the NAICS codes there. There's also, if you even Google NAICS codes, you can get a really nice Excel spreadsheet so that you can zoom in pretty fast. I noted before, O-nitrotoluene was added in November of 2013, so it's now reportable for 2014 calendar year. So that is something that you would want to be tracking. There was another chemical that was just added this year, and it's a new chemical category. So there's like 10 or 12 chemicals that fall into the chemical category. And I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's something funky. I mean, it's not like it's like particularly like adhesive manufacturers have it or something. And one of the really good things is that you can use TryMeWeb to make any revisions all the way back to 1991, which is sweet. Now, do you need to go back and revise back to 1991? No. Statute of limitations is 5 years. No need to go back to 1991, okay? But if you really want to, EPA is really, I mean, they are getting good. Region 6 has one of the best TRI coordinators I've ever dealt with, Mort Wakeland, and Morty is really good. Unannounced TRI audits. He does a lot of enforcement. He's actually a very good guy. He's very sharp, but if you're just doing something really stupid, he will nail you. And if he finds a facility in one state, he will then send his auditors out to go to the next state, and they'll Google and find out where you're located elsewhere, and then he'll direct other regions or his people to go out and do audits then. And he's really good at it. They are already talking with the different, when they do these data quality assessments, which is their version of an audit. They will tell you they don't audit, but they are even looking at DNB numbers, DUNS numbers. They want to make sure that things are right. They want latitude and longitude. They want the GPS coordinates. They want everything right. They want your parent company stuff put in there correctly. I mean, they're really trying to make sure that they have got accurate tracking. Yay. One of the things that we try to really talk about, especially on the essentials, and we actually go over it again when we talk in the advanced class, is this is a very mature program. This has been around a pretty long time. So most chemical facilities, if they've been reporting TRI, you've got some type of database. Doesn't make sure it's the best one, may not be great, but you have some type of a database. You have spreadsheets, maybe you have SOPs, you may not, you may have different bits and pieces, you may have just a lot of handwritten stuff. More and more, I mean, when I was at General Motors, everything was handwritten. Now, everything's in Excel. It's just a method of, and we've seen different things. There is not really too many TRI software systems out there. There is some that they're using, but because you've got chemical categories and trying to track, it's really tough to initially make all of that determination and just have a software that one size fits all. So, whatever works best is good, but it's really making sure that just like your air permit or anything else, they're going to get you on documentation. That is where they're going to nail you every time. And the more complex that you have of operations, they're going to really be looking for it. And the focus is going to always be on the applicability determination. Not much time will be spent on releases. That's easy. That's easy because you've already got it documented. They will check things like, okay, why are your air emissions inventory? How come the point source and the fugitive releases don't match the TRI? But not all facilities have to report point, and they report air emissions. They don't break it out to point and fugitive. But TRI requires you to do that. So you want to establish some consistency. A lot of your air emission inventory, you have a lot of insignificant activities that are not covered in your air emission inventory. But for TRI purposes, you're covering everything. So you calculate them, they're not included in both reports. So that's why numbers will differ. But you better have it documented that that's why the numbers are different. as we've said, you may have a really good TRI reporting system. Guess what? They can always be upgraded. They can always be updated. They can always become better. Remember we were talking about this morning, living documents, TRI needs to be. And what we continue to see out there is there's old systems and they just use the same old thing. And that's so dangerous, so dangerous. More because, you know, it's okay to copy over a spreadsheet, but zero out it for the next year, you know. I've done an audit and God, they had the exact same numbers for 3 years in a row. Exact same numbers. It's so cool. I mean, that is an ISO facility. Not exactly what they did. A lot of the systems, you know, the infamous they, the EPA is finding out, what we find out is that a lot of the existing TRI systems have been around for a number of years. And we're talking Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies that we're like, really? This is what your TRI database system looks like? You know, companies that are much smaller have much better tracking and much better spreadsheet and documentation of their TRI. But when they're not complete, your data generation is really going to be problematic. The big piece is learn the details of reporting. And again, it's documentation, it is assumptions, it is making sure that everything that affects your processes of how you're doing your TRI calculations and determinations are on paper or in a spreadsheet, okay? You need to assess a complete or incomplete system. This is one of the things that we get into, where Lauren and I get involved, is we just have a lot of clients and people when we have these discussions, and we did this last year in Denver. We did this presentation in October, and literally a week and a half later, Lauren and I we had one of our colleagues, one of my other client guardians up there, and he's like, got a refinery that they attended, and we had this long list of, here's what we want you to do. And I mean, it was basically everything that was on the slides. So Lauren, God bless her soul, pretty much overhauled everything. They wanted to make sure it was all included. All before the end of the year, because they had some money left over and they wanted to get, you know, and it was going to be gone by the end of the year. But again, what was really nice is it was finding all the things that have been left out. It's updating their system and making sure their SOPs. And that's having a different set of eyes to look at it isn't a bad idea. It's one of the things that, you know, as I said, we like to do, but having a different set of eyes to take a look at it, sometimes we'll find, well, what can we do? What is a little bit better system? Maybe another set of eyes finds, well, you know what? Here's another way. Here's a really good guidance document. There's things that you always want to keep in track of. Just because the spreadsheet may be good from 20 years ago, but the guidance on how the approaches or footnotes or assumptions may have changed. And guess what? 2 years ago, you knew X. As time goes on, you know more about your processes. So your brain's changing and you're learning new. Your spreadsheets should reflect that. Your assumptions can change, you know, from 2 years ago. It's like, ooh, you know what? I actually found out that we use 45% of this on maintenance-related activities when I thought it was 25%. Modify it, move on.
Is lunch at noon?
What time is it? It is noon? I think it probably is. That's right, it's on the main. Yeah, we might as well break. Let's do that.
You're just making us pay for the early break, aren't you? 10 o'clock break and 5 minutes early, you're making us pay for it now.
Yeah.
That's it, okay, yeah. I'm gonna ask you okay, wait a minute. This is not the one that I remember putting in. I put one in a different, I had a different MSDS. I actually had a Catalyst. Okay, you both know how to read MSDSs, right? Again, and that's why I'm going to kind of gloss through some of this stuff. I mean, the fact of the matter is you look at your material safety data sheet, you check and see if it's got a TRI chemical in it, and then you also want to basically find out, you know, you want to knock out every you can. If it's got benzene, and one of the things that's important, if the MSDS is good enough, 10,000 ppm is 1%. Again, what we're trying to find out is, are we 1%, are we less than 1%? We're trying to help out on de minimis here. So the fact of the matter is what you want to be, and when you get good at this, and this is what we actually cut our kids' teeth on when they started in our office, is how to read. It's MSDS Reading 101. You know, so I'll sit down for an hour, I grab a bunch of different MSDSs, and this is what I train our engineers right out of school. Here's how to read an MSDS, because that is going to be the first thing that you're going to be doing when we get to Tier I or Tier 2, and get them used to reading about all these chemicals. So if you know that you're under, if 10,000 is the 1% mark, and that is the de minimis for benzene, then I'm less than 100 ppm, I don't have to worry about it. De minimis, I'm done. I'm not going to worry about that on this particular gas. Ethyl benzene, don't have to do it. I'm done. You know, then what I do is at the top of this thing, I'll put a little nice red text box that says, not subject to TRI, de minimis. I mean, again, make it easy on you. If you have 1,000 chemicals, what you really want to do is whittle it down to 20, if you're lucky, or 100, and evaluate them. Lauren, I will have you, what do we got? We like 2 minutes? What, 12:05? Okay.
12:05, I think she's taking 5.
Oh.
I actually want to get a couple. I just want to like, one of the things that what we're doing here is, we're not, the slides, and I actually, I need to take a look at this. Lauren, can you write a note?
Yeah.
This is, and I do this is weird, because this says 2010 training slides, and I'm like, I remember putting in the 2014. So maybe I missed this one. I just want to modify slide 82 to be, look. Basically, every year, EPA actually has done some training classes that they will put together, and they'll have slides. And what we try to do is stay consistent with them, simply because we don't want to do something inconsistent, but we may look at some things in a different manner, but I've been pretty impressed with what EPA has put together and how they look at it. And if there are those gray areas, which are the fun things that I like to find, you know, when I can get old and famous and sit down and write my book, you know, my book is going to be, you know, the next TRI Q&A. But it's one of those things that they've got good slides, so we expound upon some of the other details that are going on with them. We do that at the advanced TRI class, but we do try to make sure that we keep through the guidance, because EPA's got guidance, and we are not getting into the fight that guidance is not regulations. Like, guess what? This is what they got. You know, if they made a rule that covers so many different facilities, guidance is the only way to do it. And it's to give you a sense of, here's how we would interpret it.
Corporate is the same thing.
Right.
Guidance, and we pretty much hold the science.
Right. Right. And you know, and it's
To speak to how things change, you know, over 20 years. The other thing that I'd recommend, if you haven't already, is looking at industry guidance that
Right.
trade groups have published.
Right.
And, that may give more specifics on what's getting manufactured in your process that maybe
Right.
you hadn't thought of, or
Right.
see, you know, what all the other certain types of a manufacturer reporting, and those are, you know,
Right.
things that have come out in recent years that are.
well, like you're talking about gypsum. I mean, like NCASI has really good details. API's got it. Foundry societies have it. A lot of them have their own TRI guidance documents to help out multiple, you know, help out their members. And again, those are really good things. And then there's other documents, you know, that you can look at that really are helpful, because it is, you know, EPA has their own thing. It's like AP42. Well, if you do your own stack test, or you have CEMS or something for your facility has changed a little bit, it's not going to meet AP42. So you always want to try to take advantage of the data that's out there, and it's reasonably available, which is the whole basis of this. Not creating new work, but using reasonably available data.
All right. We made
All right. Yay. Okay. Cool beans. If I walk away, I got to make sure and turn this off.